Thank you all for coming. I am Jennie Cole-Mossman, and I am now with the Nebraska Resource Project for Vulnerable Young Children. We were formerly the Infant and Toddler Court Improvement Project, and Kelly Hopman's here. She's my co-director. I think we have a good lecture for you. We're going to talk a little bit about early childhood development and the impact of domestic violence. And I'll let Jamie introduce herself. But
I'm like hiding behind you.
I know, I'm like trying to move from one side to the other. I think she's going to really bring a new kind of fresh perspective to some of the cases that we deal with where we've got domestic violence. So I'll let you introduce yourself.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Jamie. I'm currently the executive director of a dual domestic violence and sexual assault program over in Hastings, which you guys would call West. I'm not from Nebraska originally, so I'm really enjoying kind of the regional variations. There's wind in Nebraska. If you guys want to just add that to your brochure, that would be ideal. The reason I mentioned that I'm not from Nebraska is because it will kind of play a role as far as why I get to be in front of you today. So first of all, welcome. Thank you so much for being here on a Friday afternoon. I did want to just let you know a couple of things. So obviously my role currently is a very niche role. I work exclusively in domestic violence and sexual assault, but prior to the last 10 years have been exclusively in child welfare. So I take the last 10 years professionally in child welfare, but also kind of a lifetime in it. My parents are actually therapeutic foster parents and have been for the last 25 years. We're originally from Maine. That means we've had 168 therapeutic boys. That were my siblings growing up. So I was a biological child in a foster home. I remember some of my better friends as a teenager were caseworkers. So I've been exposed early and often to kind of all varieties of what the child welfare system has to offer and what the experience is for children who have been directly impacted by violence. So the reason, though, I get to be really here today is because when I lived in Florida and worked in child welfare, we implemented a system called the Safe and Together model. I don't know how far that's made it east yet, but the premise of the Safe and Together model is ultimately that you can do child welfare by doing two things really well. One, partnering with the protective parent, and two, holding the offender accountable in hopes that you'll be more likely to keep a child safe in the home with that protective parent. So we actually failed at it 3 times, and that's really why I'm here. We got it right the 4th time. It took us 4 times. And some of the things that we learned, the bumps along the way, are some tidbits that I'm going to share with you, not because you're necessarily going to be implementing the Safe and Together model as it were, but because doing the Safe and Together model, implementing a child-based domestic violence lens really helps us just do better casework across the board. So we're going to kind of get started by saying that really the objective of today, as is your objective I'm sure every day, is to really get a focus on child safety, but acknowledging it from the differentiated roles here in the room. So can I get a kind of a mix of, do we have CASA? Okay, awesome. I'm actually a CASA volunteer. Oh, they gave me a 17-year-old girl. Awesome. She's texting me now. So do we have any guardian ad litem? Okay, fantastic. Welcome all. Attorneys, I know we've got some county attorney folks. Okay. Judges, I know we've got 1, maybe others, or just judges don't want to raise their hands. I don't know. I assume we've got frontline workers, caseworkers, supervisors, admins, anyone from the actual child welfare or on the ground side? Anyone I missed? I say things directed toward your positions during the later part, so did I miss anyone so I can make it extra relevant?
We work for the school in early childhood.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
I work in early childhood.
Awesome.
Year to 5 years for child.
Oh, well, great. You know more about this than I do in certain ways, I'm sure. I was a child once from 0 to 5, and that's really the expertise that I bring today. So I'm operating off of 2 assumptions. One, and I should tell you what my assumptions are up front. The number 1 assumption is the age-old assumption that you are here because you want to keep kids safe and that you want to help families. Is there anyone who doesn't believe that? Okay, good, because I was going to say, Jennie, we can get them coffee.
Yeah,
yes. The second assumption that I'm operating off of and how I base a lot of this information, as does Jennie, is this idea that you are already doing really good work. And so a lot of the feedback today is on the nuances of it. And so it's not about we are going to change everything that we all do because we want to do better work. It's that we're going to tweak things. Okay, so what is today? This is very high up. So I'm going to crane my neck a little bit, even though I can see it from 4 angles. Okay, I will stand here. So we're going to kind of key in on 6 things. Jennie told me that when you train in Omaha, Sarpy County area, they want to know what they're learning. So I have bullet pointed it for you. 6 things. First thing that we're going to learn is that not understanding domestic violence is actually one of the greatest risks to child safety, full stop. And we'll talk about that. Number 2, that we need to know what domestic violence is, but also what it is not. Usually you can define something by what it is by just simply knowing what it is. But because domestic violence is particularly complex and it has a series of social biases, personal biases, and other elements at play, we really also have to understand what it isn't, because we don't want some of these myths, some of these biases to kind of creep up into our understanding. The next piece is to know what it actually looks like. Most of the time when we're working a drug case, I know what someone who's high looks like. Domestic violence is, again, very varied and complex. And so we want to know what it looks like so that you can know what you're looking for. We want to know why it matters. We want to also know how to keep kids safe within your role, right? Going back to that first slide, accepting that everyone here has a very key role to play in the welfare of children and how this applies to you. So we do try to make this very, very useful and relevant for all people here. And then also the idea, the notion that this is just good common sense and good case work, full stop. So that's what today is.
And we welcome questions as we go along too. So if there are things that we are saying or ideas that you don't agree or you want to have a discussion about it, we hope that that happens throughout the presentation.
Yes.
And I'm really bad at setting up these beginning things. We did not build in any breaks, so feel free to get up and move about if you feel like you need to use the restroom. They're out the doors and I think to the left. But we didn't really plan on any breaks. We thought we'd keep all the time that we had for discussion, and then hopefully if you got out a little bit early on a Friday, you wouldn't mind leaving a little early. So, yeah.
So I'm still driving back to Hastings, and hopefully it won't be raining by then. But yes, so to Jennie's point, I kind of get brought in for like the color. There are some things that I'm going to say that are going to challenge the current paradigm. And it's really important that we are open to that idea, but in order to be open to that idea, we have to be willing to challenge it and to challenge me. So by all means, please feel free to do so. There's no right or wrong answer to this. There's only the idea that to recognize and embrace the complexity of it is really the key. So we will kind of talk a little bit about that. So I realize I have started, number 1, with something quite provocative, which is that not understanding domestic violence is actually the greatest risk to child safety when we look at child welfare. And there's a couple of reasons why that is. And I'm going to try to remember the first one. The number 1 reason, there we go, if we don't understand what domestic violence is, we aren't able to appropriately intervene. And the example that I have for that is how many people have kids? Children of their own. That is incredible. I have a puggle. But so if you have a child and you see them scratching at a cut, you're going to say, don't scratch that cut, you're going to get it infected, right? Or it's going to make the cut worse, or it's going to have a scar. The challenge with domestic violence is that if we don't really understand it, we, in our capacity, whether that's as a judge, whether that's an attorney, frontline worker, educators, we actually are going to make it worse, okay? And so we have to know that, because this isn't one of those things that just gets better by virtue of us existing. This is one of the things that could actually get better or worse by virtue of us existing. And that's a really key point. The second reason that domestic violence and not understanding it can pose a great risk to children is that it's in the majority of your cases. So I've worked in 4 states, Texas, Nebraska, Maine, and Florida, in the child welfare systems there. Our local CASA office estimates that the current open cases they have see higher than 75% involving domestic violence. And we're going to define domestic violence, and that might help. Florida, we implemented the Safe and Together model, started rolling it out across the state. When we measured at the intake level at the state how many cases involved domestic violence, at one point my county had over 91%. It was like 91.2. That coded in for domestic violence. So by virtue of the fact that this happens in almost all of our cases and that the dosage is so high, we certainly need to kind of have some expertise in it, because it really is impacting most of the cases that we're working. So those are the 2 big reasons, but suffice it to say, we're going to talk later about some of the long-term impacts on child development, children's capacity to heal and thrive, but also the impact on the protective parents. Most people have heard of things like ACE scores, the adverse childhood experiences. The more adverse experiences you have in your childhood, the greater exposure to trauma. the more likely you are to have things like diabetes, obesity, mental health issues, substance abuse issues, long-term implications. So today, in the frame that we're working in, we want to keep this kid X, whoever this darling child is today, safe. But not understanding the complexity of domestic violence can actually mean that we aren't going to keep child X safe when they hit 18 or 19. Because they're going to have long-term exposure to violence, long-term exposures to traumatic events, and subsequently long-term exposures to issues that are going to plague them well into adulthood. And we will talk more about that. Does that make sense to folks? Why, if we don't understand this, this is going to pose an issue? Okay. I was hoping that would make sense. Now I can just go home. So we're going to talk about what domestic violence is and is not. Jennie has added fabulous photos. I was just putting words up on slides. The reason they're pretty is because of Jennie. Okay, so this is one of the most universal definitions of domestic violence. It is a pattern of intentional, coercive behaviors. They're used by one partner to gain or maintain control over that other partner. Okay, so a pattern, intentional, coercive, power and control. So let's break it down. It includes repeated, I keep looking up as if I can't see anything, repeated physical abuse, emotional or psychological abuse. It has sexual violence, destruction of pets, your property, financial abuse, progressive social isolation, deprivation, and or intimidation. So usually when there's smaller groups or more time, I key in a little bit more on this definition, but I've gone ahead and just underlined and bolded some of the key words that I think are usually pretty unique to the audiences that I train. When I ask them what stands out to you, they usually, bless you. Are you going to sneeze again?
Probably.
Have I ruined it for you? So the three key words that are usually not talked about in the child welfare system are this concept of pattern, intentional, and repeated. Usually in the child welfare context, and I still do this, we say words like there was an incident of domestic violence, right? I said it yesterday, and I said, Jamie, oh my gosh, you're going to go train. Well, there was that incident, you guys, you know what I mean. So we usually talk about in the concept of incidences, occurrences, domestic disturbances. We usually talk about it in the concept of, well, how many police reports do they have? Okay, and what we're talking about with this definition is that actually by conceptualizing domestic violence as an incident or a moment or a police report or an intake, we're actually looking at it as a still shot. But the very definition of the crime is that it's a pattern. That it's historic, that it's chronic, that it's constant. And so we kind of need to, that's where the real paradigm shift I think needs to happen. That's where it really caught hold for me, was when I understood that how child welfare is set up is that we're only looking at what we see on paper. And what we see on paper is only a moment. But domestic violence is so much more than that. So I do want to tackle the one elephant in the room, which is who's perpetrating this crime. And there's a lot of research out there. There's also a lot of experience and anecdotal evidence out there. But I will tell you based on how I've defined, I'm pointing like as if you can see what I'm pointing at. It's a slide. What we know is based on this definition, domestic violence is perpetrated by men 95% of the time, by women about 5% of the time. What that breaks down to numerically is about 1 in 4 women and about 1 in 121 men. That means that it's 39.6 million women in their lifetime in the United States and about 800,000 men. So yes, it happens to men. Men and women hit each other all the time. You guys read it in your reports, right? It was mutual, there were dual combatants, we both slugged at each other, both parties have injuries, therefore both parties are responsible. But when we look at this definition of what domestic violence is, both parties might be responsible in that instant, but both parties cannot, by virtue of the definition of domestic violence as defined for the last 40 years, actually be mutual, because we're talking about power and control. I'm talking about one person exerting control over another person for negative gain. So if I have control and Jennie does not, she cannot be mutually, equally responsible for the violence in the home, okay? So, oh, she added binoculars. I told her I'm not even gonna recognize the slides. I haven't seen these yet. She's fantastic. We've only met twice, so this should be interesting because we've never co-facilitated anything together. That's why we were both like running into each other earlier. I told her, I wonder.
And it's great because they're videotaping this first time we ever do this.
And putting it up on YouTube.
Yeah. I'm sure by the time we get to North Platte, we'll have all this smoothed out.
I know.
You won't be able to see it, but just trust us.
Yeah, or just drive to North Platte because I hear it's nice. I hear there's a golden spike because of the train. I don't know. Anyway.
You're going to want to go see the golden
I
spike.
wikied it when I heard I was going to North Platte. So what does domestic violence look like? How many people have ever been involved with a family who used meth? It's like a Nebraska thing, let me tell you. It hasn't made its way down to Key West yet because Key West is a 2-mile by 4-mile island, and so like getting those meth barns is really difficult to do, although now they have portable like 2-liter bottle meth shops. Okay, so if we have meth cases, what are some key indicators that there's meth in the house? Give me one. What are you gonna find? How do we know? Anyone? What? What does someone look like when they're high on meth? Do they look like me? Don't you say it. I really walked into that one. What do they have on their face?
They have sores that they pick out.
Sores on their arms.
They're moving constantly.
Yeah, kind of like me.
Yeah.
Right there, I had a guy on meth in my office yesterday. Right? Can we test for meth? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Last I checked, we can test for meth. There's a drug test for that. Domestic violence, there is no drug test. There is no test for domestic violence. And so it becomes particularly important that we understand what we're looking for, because how are you going to know it's there if you don't know what you're looking for? Because we can't like make someone pee in a cup and be like, yes, there is domestic violence. Done. Now, the county attorneys are going, ooh, that is an idea. Okay. Okay. So everything in domestic violence uses a wheel. If you've never gone to Google like domestic violence, do it, because everything will be in the shape of a wheel. It's raining. Now people are really going to fall asleep. They're going to be full and tired, and now they're going to have the calm
sound
rain.
of rain.
Ah. Okay. So I'm going to very briefly do this, but I would strongly encourage you, because I usually do this in the course of 8 hours. So I'm going to strongly encourage you to do some of your own research, or ask me back, or talk to your domestic violence program. There is a fantastic one here in Sarpy County. So intimidation, that might mean I'm cocking my fist back. That might mean that I am standing over her. That might mean in your team meetings, my favorite thing they do, they stand against the wall like this and just look at her. You ever wonder why she hates team meetings and never shows up? It's because he's standing against the wall staring at her like he's going to kill her later. That would be intimidation. Emotional abuse. Worst mom ever. Okay, if some of these words are offensive, imagine living in the household with them. Isolation. How many of you guys get reimbursed for mileage? Sometimes it is such a pain in the butt for me to get reimbursed for mileage, I don't even bother turning it in unless it's more than 50 miles, because I got to do my starting odometer, and I'm too honest, so I'm like checking it. And then you got to do your ending odometer. I have a perpetrator right now who has a log for his victim where he has the start and end of her odometer reading. I don't even get reimbursed 51 cents a mile because it's such a pain, but I have a perpetrator who is so willing to isolate, make it so difficult for her to leave her comfort area, that he's willing to actually track her odometer. Okay? Other forms of isolation. Your mom is a huge pain in the butt. Can we please not go there for Christmas? So they don't go for Christmas. Then mom's mad at her. Then they don't go for Christmas after that, or Christmas after that. Your friends are a real pain in the butt. I have a perpetrator right now who checks her underwear every time she comes home. Every time. So at a certain point, your victim's going to actually start self-isolating, because I don't want to have to go through the ripping my pants off, checking my underwear every time I come home. I'm just going to stop going out. But guess what? That's not a crime technically. So I've been told. So minimizing, denying, blaming. Baby, if you'd have not nagged me, I would never have done this. Okay? I have a dishwasher at home. It's the first time I've ever had a dishwasher. And my partner, Craig, he is a gem. And there's a vortex just like this one around our dishwasher, because the dishes will be on or around that dishwasher, but never make it in there. And I don't know why. So I'm going to nag Craig. Craig, please, please, please put the dishes in the dishwasher. Please put the dishes in the dishwasher. But I'm not going to throw the dish at him and say, you effing better put it in the dishwasher. So there's a difference between nagging, because I have the right to have my partner understand that the dishwasher opens and you put the dishes in and you hit start and it cleans everything. But I don't have the right to belittle him. I don't have the right to make him feel fearful. I don't have the right to blame him for the reason that I'm upset. We happen to blame our victims a lot too, and we'll talk about that. Using children. How many times do you read the news and you see dad kidnaps child? That's almost always a domestic violence context. The number one thing that women are worried about from March until August is dad leaving with the kids on one of their scheduled visits. One of the other things that we use with children, I have a gentleman right now who nailed the doors. This is in Hastings, Nebraska, people. I have a guy who nailed the front and back doors shut and then screwed all the windows shut. This is Monday. And then what he did was, so mom was at work, and so he did this with the kids in the house. And he doesn't even live in the house, by the way. He hasn't lived there for 8 months. He has a girlfriend. He lives with the girlfriend in another house. So he's gone into her home, but they're still legally married. It's still technically their house. Done all of this. There's a 4- and an 8-year-old. It was the 4-year-old's birthday. She comes home with the cake and the birthday presents. Baby, I promise I'll be home right after I get out of work. She can't get in the house. So what does dad do? He sits there and he berates the kids and says, your mom is an effing liar. She said she was going to be here for you, and she didn't even bother showing up on your birthday. So when the child welfare agencies get involved, the kids are like, I don't like my mom. That's going to be using your children. And that's pretty traumatizing for all of you who are parents. Can you imagine your kids not being there for their 4th birthday, having that birthday cake out? Economic abuse, forcing an allowance, not giving access to credit cards. I have a woman who for 14 years has his grocery list. She's never shopped for groceries on her list a day in her life. They're forced to work or they're not allowed to work. It's really one or the other. Male privilege. What does male privilege look like? It's justifying your actions based on your role as the head of the household. So anything really along that line. So, I have the right to control you because you're mine, you're my property, right? Women still get walked down the aisle given away by their dads. Very sweet gesture. Dads are still asked for permission to get married most of the time. My sister's fiance didn't bother, but whatever. But anyway, so that's really what that male privilege is. It's really used to dominate and to justify that dominance, which we would call power and control or domestic violence. So then coercion and threats. My number one favorite, and if you don't know this is being used, it's being used every day, often. I'm going to call CPS on you. Okay? And they really believe that they're going to be in for the fight of their lives because they must really be abusing their kids. Okay. So that was a very quick rendition. That actually takes me an hour and a half when I'm training frontline child welfare workers.
But you guys are so smart. We
don't even need it.
10 minutes top.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do we start aligning with today and what the real focus is about today? So I just kind of went through wham, bam, thank you, ma'am version of what domestic violence tactics might look like. And some of them might sound familiar to you, or renditions of them might sound familiar to you. But let's talk about it in the context of child development, because really the argument that we're making today is that child welfare is about child safety, and domestic violence is a huge factor in whether or not children are safe, but not just in their safety, but their overall capacity to thrive. And that's where Jennie's expertise really is. So let's kind of transition into that discussion. So there's really 2 types of exposures. You have this very direct exposure, and then you have a less direct exposure. So some of the examples would be of a more direct exposure is actually seeing the violence, so seeing a parent assaulted. More likely than not, though, it's very important to know that domestic violence is physical only about 10% of the time. That whole, where's my little circle? Oh, there it is. Most of this, as you notice, was not physical. In fact, very few examples I gave were physical.
And most of which is not going to be in a police report.
Yes.
No one's going to be in a police report that you got your underwear checked every day.
Right.
So.
I have a whole slide on that. But yes, it's a perfect segue because I don't know which way I'm going. Most of the tactics that perpetrators use, they're very sophisticated. Most of the tactics that they're using don't actually rise to the level of criminal. Okay? They don't actually rise to the level of an intake. He's checking my underwear every day. What's your intake worker going to say? That sounds awful, but ... you're not I got told the other day, well, it's not an infant and it's not a 2-year-old who might be killed, so I'm not going to take your call. I said, okay. So a lot of this doesn't actually rise to the occasion of something that would be documented. That's why when we talk about the definition of domestic violence, it's so essential to look at it in the context of a pattern, of something that's intentional, right? It's never an accident that the remote gets thrown at her. It's never an accident that there's a hole in the wall. It's never an accident that the kids got locked out or the mom got locked out of the house and the doors were nailed shut. Think about it from a child welfare standpoint. My first question was, what if there was a fire? This man is so willing to perpetrate on his victim on his 4-year-old's birthday that he doesn't care. They could have gone up in smoke, the whole of them. How would they have gotten out? The best part is actually by the time she does wrangle her way into the house at 3 a.m., by the time they're all asleep, he actually chases her out. She tries to drive away in her car. He jumps in front. The cops tried to say that she tried to run him over, but she was trying to escape with the kids, so much so that as she's driving away, he throws a knife. You know how hard you have to throw a knife for it to crack and actually break through that back window to the 4-year-old who's sitting in his car seat? He has 14 lacerations on his cheek from the glass. The knife is open, so heaven forbid that it had actually hit the child or damaged the child directly. But that's the extent of the I wonder if that's this. That's the extent of the perpetration. And so when we talk about what kind of exposure a child might be privy to and how traumatizing that might be, that would be a really good example of a direct exposure, okay? A very charismatic expression of a bullet point. Hearing loud conflict and violence, so the very yelling things, again, that might not be criminal. Holding the child hostage, that would be an example the other night from Monday. Seeing a parent arrested can actually be one of the most traumatizing events for a child. But then also really importantly is this loss of the protective parent from the routine. One of the things that I used to do all the time was if she doesn't get a PO, or if she's the one, heaven forbid, who got arrested for assaulting him, then she's getting kicked out of the house. She's gonna stay home with the perpetrator. So then these children lose their protective parent, their nurturer. That can be a very direct exposure to trauma. And then some of the less direct, not getting that child support. Mom, I really want to go to camp this summer. Sorry, they don't get any child support. Minimum payment for child support is $50. Most of the perpetrators that we have on our roster, we have about 1,348 right now that we monitor. 6 of them paid child support. Prolonged court proceedings, custody process, things like threatening violence against the pets. I have a perpetrator who he holds the dog and threatens to spoon the eyeball out. So I have the 6-year-old boy who he has a puggle. He says it's a pug beagle, and he says that it's a beagle in the front and a pug in the back. And then, of course, undermining that protective parent's capacity to parent. So if we say kids can thrive with their protective parent, but they're undermining that effort, we're really doing some less direct but still exposure to trauma and violence. So let's talk about why it matters. So Jennie's going to talk very awesomely about how children exposed to trauma are actually affected in their development. Well, let's talk about what some of the factors are that might actually influence how children respond to this violence. This is, again, a very important reason why we can't look at domestic violence based on what the police report said, or why we can't look at domestic violence based on what the intake worker says, because when we don't understand the broader pattern, we can't actually identify some of the factors in the home that are going to be affecting or influencing a child's capacity to thrive. I should mention that one of my jobs prior was actually an expert witness. I was certified to testify between the nexus of a behavior in the home, a maltreatment, and the impact on that child. So I would actually make or break a case by saying, yes, that is considered abuse. And so one of the things that I know for you guys, for the benefit especially of the attorneys and judges in the room, is that it's very hard sometimes when things don't rise to the level of criminal for you to find nexus. But let's look at this in a little bit more depth, understanding that this might be one of the ways that you find that nexus, okay? So we know that if violence is serious or frequent, it can be more influential to children. How old that child is, were they physically hurt, were they put in danger, how does a child usually cope with problems? Have they been exposed to problems in the past? And then, of course, what the protective parent's capacity is to intervene. And well, I do have one quick example, and that is I have a mom right now who's lactating. She just gave birth to the baby 9 weeks ago. It'll be 9 weeks this week. And she's in such duress from the violence that she's actually stopped lactating. So she's no longer able to breastfeed her child. She had to transition to child to formula. Child's allergic to everything. Child had to go to children's. Child is now on a special formula. And all because of the stress she's under at home. So when we talk about factors that influence it, if we just read that police report, if we just see the mutual combatant side of it, we have no idea what other factors are really at play. How do I know what other factors are at play? We're going to talk more about this later in the skills section, because I hate walking away from a training not ever getting any skills, and I wonder, like, why did I go? So we have some skills parts later. So a lot of the time when you guys are very sophisticated, so I trust that this doesn't happen all that often, but sometimes we derail in our meetings, and it's okay. And sometimes we get focused on questions like, well, why'd she choose him in the first place? Look at him, he's such a jerk. I have some really good rebuttals to that. I'm going to use this one. How many of you have ever been in a relationship before? If you have kids, that's kind of an inevitability. So how many of you, just come on, just stretch your arms, yes. So most people in the room have been in at least one relationship in their life. So how many of you, when you got into that relationship, asked to be hit, slap, punch, called? No one. Perpetrators groom their victims. They never start out calling you a because you wouldn't get in the relationship in the first place. What they do is they start out really sweet, mellow, awesome, caring, compassionate. What he did to you in the past, baby, I would never do to you again. I'm going to take care of you and your kids. Right? That's the person they're falling in love with. That's the person they're in a relationship with. That's the person who they're trying to co-parent with. And then they end up in a relationship where the perpetrator then preys on their vulnerabilities and then starts perpetrating. Intentionally, using a pattern, coercively, right? All these words. So instead of asking, why did she choose him? Can we ask questions like, why doesn't the abuser stop? Okay? Can you believe she still loves him? Last time I looked in a magazine, it was like husband and wife and their babies. Our society says you should love your baby daddy and you should want to have a co-parent. You should certainly try to be married if at all possible. So we wonder why she still loves him. He's the parent of the children, possibly even her husband, who she committed her life to. Get over the fact that she still loves him and just say, okay, she still loves him. How does that impact child safety? It doesn't. Whether she loves him or not doesn't have an indicator for child safety. You couldn't prove a case on it, so don't ask about it. Why doesn't she just leave? You're 7 times more likely to be killed at the point of your departure in your relationship. So if the child welfare system is so focused on people leaving, you're going to potentially get kids killed on a 7 times more likely rate. Okay, so that can't be our challenge, our solution either. Why doesn't she just pick herself up and move on? When we look back at the tactics, she's isolated, she has no credit, she has no family or friends. Her kids want to love dad and hate her, all these types of things. And then my favorite is she failing to protect the kids from him? Is she failing to protect the kids from him? Okay, I get it. I understand that people have to have protective capacities, and if they can't protect, they shouldn't necessarily be parenting. But if our sole question is she failing to protect the kids from him and not what is he doing to hurt the children, we've kind of lost sight of our goal. So let's look at things instead like questions that promote safety. What behaviors is he engaging in that are challenging child safety? What are the impacts of his behaviors on the children or the family? What are the protective factors that he or she has been exhibiting in the home that might actually relate to child safety and keep the kids safely in the home? And then more importantly, and we will talk about this for a couple minutes later on, is my role in this family actually causing more harm? Okay, are you the one scratching the wound and getting it infected? Domestic violence is very unpredictable, it's very dangerous, it's very life-threatening, potentially. If there's something that you're doing, if you have a misunderstanding of what domestic violence is, we don't have an idea of what's actually causing safety concerns in the home based on a broader picture, because we don't have all the information, because we're not asking good questions, you might actually, with your intervention, be causing more harm and potentially getting a family killed. We have something like 68 protection orders in Florida from my county. Every one of those protection orders spells out exactly how he's going to kill her. None of those protection orders were granted, and she was killed in exactly the way as described in those protection orders each and every time. These people are the experts in what's going to cause risk, what's going to cause safety concerns, and we really need to open up an opportunity and a dialogue to assess what those things are. Does that mean that kids always stay safe in the home? No. I'm not a proponent of kids stay safely in the home. My parents are foster parents. They gotta make a living. Okay, I'm just kidding. You don't make any money in foster care. Okay, Jenny, all you.
Okay, I'm going to take over a little bit, and we're going to talk about the specifics to young children. And so there's a couple myths that come up all the time, and one of the first ones is always that young children don't really understand what's happening. That kind of before the age of 5, they don't really know what's going on. They can't understand that language. But they actually do, and they can adapt their behavior accordingly. So I'm going to show you a little experiment. This is where I really hope our technology works.
We can always act it out, Jenny.
Yeah, I can be the baby.
I've seen the video. I can.
So the baby is sitting on the lap of a caregiver that they have a secure attachment with. So they should be relatively comfortable. And this is a research project.
I love this baby.
Teresa. I'm going to sit for your magazine. Okay. That's Kelly. Kelly's going to sit for your magazine. Kelly, look at this.
That's aggravating. That's so annoying.
Oh, I thought it was really interesting.
Well, that's just your opinion. It's aggravating.
So half of what that's good. What I want to say, so I think we're doing good. Do you think I should do an NPR story or just talk about it? I've made my key point. Okay.
Can I see that? Thank you. Kelly's coming. Bye-bye. Kelly went. Bye-bye.
So what do you see in the video? First of all, does he look like he's observant and he knows what's going on in the room? Right? And we know he's taking it all in. What happens when the woman comes in and she's angry about the beads? He checks her out, so he's aware of what's going on. What else does he do? He changes his behavior based upon her. So when we have those cases and they're saying, well, you know, they're 2, they don't really know what's going on, they do adapt their behavior. And we're going to talk a little bit later about how that impacts development, but I'm sure that you all see that. And you might see kids that do that kind of freezing, or they're really hypervigilant, and we'll talk about trauma symptoms, but they have adapted their behavior to try to cope with their surroundings. So this is the other one. How many of you, when you get a police report where there's domestic violence, where is the baby always at?
Upstairs in the bedroom.
Sleeping in the bedroom, sleeping in the crib, sleeping in the car seat. They sleep through these horrific police incidents. And sometimes they may actually be sleeping. But I'm going to have you listen to what's an NPR story, so it's very intelligent, of course, because it's on NPR, that talks about brain scans that they did with babies and their ability to actually, while they're sleeping, they actually react to angry voices. Oops. Why am I on a different slide?
This is Morning Edition from NPR News. I'm Renee Montaigne.
And I'm Steve Inskeep. Good morning. Today in Your Health, we have 2 stories about angry parents and how their arguments affect their children. We've known for a long time that when parents fight a lot, it can have a psychological impact on kids. In fact, some parents know this so well that they save their arguments until after they put the kids to bed. This morning, we start with some disturbing new research on how arguments by parents affect infants. NPR science correspondent Shankar Vedantam is here to tell us about it. Hi, Shankar.
Hi, Steve.
Okay, so what is this new research telling us that was not known before?
Well, so lots of studies have looked at the link between parental conflict and outcomes in children, and most of them have looked at children who are older. And what researchers find is that there's a lot of variability. So some children seem to react really adversely to their parents fighting, and other children seem largely fine.
Some kids act out and become angry themselves. Some kids may just find a way to deal with it.
Yeah, so researchers have been asking what explains this variability among children. And one of the theories that they're exploring is that your experiences very early in life might sculpt the way you respond to conflict the rest of your life.
Well, now this is really interesting because we're talking about kids who obviously haven't learned to speak yet. They don't really know what's going on. They can't necessarily follow the argument, but they're asking, does it affect the kid anyway?
Exactly. So researchers at the University of Oregon decided to conduct brain scans on a couple dozen infants. And it's a completely non-invasive procedure, but you have to lie really still in the scanner. Now, obviously, these are children who are 6 months to a year old. You can't expect them to lie still in a scanner, especially because it makes this really loud din. And so the researchers said, what if the children were asleep? Is it possible that they're still taking in information even when they're asleep? And we can test to see how their brains respond to different kinds of conflict. So Alice Graham, Phil Fisher, and Jennifer Pfeiffer, they had parents bring in a whole bunch of babies at bedtime. And when the children were asleep, they put the infants into the scanner, stuck headphones on them, and played these different sentences. And these weren't actual words and actual sentences, but these were nonsense sentences in different tones of voice. Some of them were angry, and some of them were neutral, and some of them were happy. I asked her what these sounded like, and here's what she told me.
So maybe very angry would be like, I polamented a Mopar. And just angry would be, I polamented a Mopar. And then in a neutral tone of voice, it might be, I polamented a Mopar. And then in a happy tone of voice, it might be, I polamented a Mopar.
Now I'm thinking about all the different ways I can say that nonsense phrase. I polamented a Mopar? I polamented a Mopar. So what, Shunker, did the researchers find when they played these syllables to kids in different ways?
So Graham told me she was astonished to find that the babies' brains actually reacted differently to the happy and the angry tones, that she could actually detect differences in brain reactions to these different tones. And what this shows is that even when children are asleep, they are still taking in information. And that was not the most interesting thing. She found that the babies who came from high-conflict homes, these are homes where the parents are shouting at one another, yelling at one another, calling each other names, these babies not only had even higher activation in the brain in response to angry tones, the activation was in specific areas of the brain linked to emotional functioning. Here she is again.
What we see for the infants in higher conflict homes is that they're showing greater reactivity to the very angry tone of voice, and that reactivity is in brain regions that we think are important later on in terms of your ability to regulate your emotions and function well.
That's Alice Graham, who spoke with Shankar Vedantam. And Shankar, I want to make sure I understand this. You're saying these are kids who have already, as infants, witnessed a lot of fighting. And when these angry sounds are played to them, you see their brains responding differently than other children. They seem to have been changed already by the experience of witnessing this fighting.
Yes, so the big question, Steve, is what do the changes in the brain actually mean? One possible interpretation is that these children are somehow already being scarred for life and that they're going to respond to conflict in these heightened ways. Another interpretation could be this is how the brain learns to be resilient, and by adapting and changing, you actually are going to reduce your reactivity to conflict later in life. So I don't think we know exactly what it means that you're seeing these brain changes, but I think what we can say for sure is that what the study shows is that parents need to be aware that children are listening to what they say even when they're asleep.
That's NPR science correspondent Shankar Vedantam. Shankar, thanks for coming by.
Thanks, Steve.
So what we learned from those two clips is all of those excuses that we hear, all of those things that we hear about, we don't need to do any treatment, we don't need to worry about, and we're going to talk about treatment later on, but we don't need to worry about it because kids too young to remember, kids not verbal, is that even as an infant, while they're sleeping, their brain is adapting and changing based upon that interaction. Specific things that might cause distress in infants and toddlers, I always think that's interesting for toddlers. Loud noises and yelling, because if you have toddlers, you know they're loud. It should probably be angry, loud noises. Sudden and unpredictable loud noises. The next one I think is really important, and we're going to speak to a little bit later, but disruptions in the bonding process between parent and child. So if you are constantly under the threat of violence or under someone else's control, your ability to breastfeed, your ability to tend to a child's needs are going to be compromised. Distracted or depressed parents who can't attend to the child's needs. There's a risk of physical injury, lack of consistent nutrition. Jamie talked about that with the breastfeeding, but other basic needs or financial abuse.
We're trying to sort out where we have to stand to be in the line of fire for the camera. But I just wanted to kind of reiterate what Jennie's saying with regards to some of the things that are really pressing as far as toddlers and infants in their development. We talk about things like loud noises or access to your protective parent, and then we kind of flip it back real quickly to this idea of perpetrator tactics. And don't a lot of the things that perpetrators are utilizing as power and control actually contributing to and are actually identified directly as things that are impacting the capacity for children to ultimately thrive? So I just kind of wanted to draw that connection right back to it.
Yeah, and I think one of the common ones I used to see when I practiced, so I forget because I know a lot of you, I did a really poor job of introducing myself, but I used to be a therapist for over 10 years, and then I worked at Court Improvement, and I trained therapists to do child-parent psychotherapy. So kind of small people are my specialty. And in my cases, what I would see a lot of times was the power and control over the parenting. So belittling mom in front of the kids, and then the kids don't respect mom, and then in turn saying things like, these kids are out of control. She can't control the kids. And if you can't control the kids, that's all on you. You've got a problem. When really it's been systematically belittling mom in front of the kids, telling the kids not to do what mom says, doing things like, checking underwear or taking keys and finances away from mom. So those kinds of things.
And then you envision the teenage daughter who lives in that home, what she's identifying as a healthy relationship or a healthy interaction with a partner who loves her, cares about her, is supposed to love her unconditionally, and you see that he's checking mom's underwear. Is this normal? Is this okay? And so we actually also have a third layer that Jennie and I aren't really going to talk about today, but that's also what the role modeling is from the perpetrator's perspective. How do you teach a kid at school to stop, drop, and roll in the fire department when dad just nailed the window shut? It's complicated.
I think what makes us unique and why we put the asterisks on how old is the child is infants and toddlers are completely dependent upon their caregivers. And I said at this point, this is what I normally do. So you look at the person next to you that you drove up with or that's sitting next to you. I want you to look at them and imagine you being entirely dependent upon that person for feeding you, for bathing you, for driving you wherever you need to go, for meeting all of your needs physically and emotionally. And most people start laughing because they're like, I don't trust who I drove with to meet all of my, emotional needs, let alone my physical ones. But that is what makes this unique, is that with infants and toddlers, they are completely reliant on that caregiver. So everything they need to learn, everything they need to grow, everything they learn about relationships is coming from the caregiver. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of in general what infants and toddlers need, and then we're going to run through a case. We thought that would be the best way. And I think in your packet I put some resources. There's one that kind of gives you some trauma symptoms, and then there's a couple other ones from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And that's really a great resource. They have wonderful full-color resources that you can print off and give to parents to talk about domestic violence when you're working with kids. But these are some things in general, and I know like the EDN folks here can speak to this a lot about what kids need. They need exposure to language, including motherese, that kind of sing-songy language, reading, singing. They need a safe environment to explore. If you think about what we've been discussing about what the environment looks like where there's domestic violence, exploration is really compromised. Kids aren't able to wander off from mom. They aren't able to go places. If mom's really isolated, they aren't going to the Children's Museum that afternoon,
No.
right? They aren't going on play dates. They aren't doing those things. They need social interactions, predictability and routines. This can really be compromised, and we may repeat some of these things, but a common one that we have is interrupting bedtime routines to punish mom. She's spending too much time with the kids or interrupting meal times. You need to get my dinner first and not getting the baby's dinner.
And I wanted to interject because ironically enough, I just had a case yesterday, which is why I'm looking at my slides because I didn't have a whole lot of time to prep them. I have a mom right now who she would hoard cans of food in the back of her car because dad controls that grocery list. I'm not like making up these examples. These things amazingly enough happen. But anyway, so he found out about this stockpile of canned corn in particular, or tuna fish and things like that she kept in the trunk. And so for months, he berated her and the kids right around bedtime. And she's got anywhere from a 6-year-old to a 14-year-old. And so one of the things that he would do is that's when he'd be most physically violent with the kids, because what happens when 6-year-olds go to bed? I need a cup of water. Can I get some milk? I got to go potty again. And that would frustrate him to no end. And so that's when he would be physically violent toward the daughter. So what the mom started doing was actually giving him a couple beers to get him to chill out. She put the game on, she gave him a couple beers, and one of the things that the worker involved in the case said was she's enabling him, she's really allowing him to drink. But after a while, he caught on, and so she'd have to drink a beer or two with him. And so, well, mom's getting drunk too, and it's like, no, this was her best way of protecting those kids in that moment, And then they came across her hoarding the cans of food and actually tried to call her out for saying that she's negligent toward the children and that she's malnourishing them because she's got all this food in her car, but the kids are hungry. So when you start looking at it in the global context, some of the things in a snippet that look awkward, mom's getting drunk at night with dad, that's why they're fighting, okay? Mom's hoarding food, the kids are malnourished. When you actually look at it in the global context of parent control, it becomes very obvious, doesn't it, of who's really trying to protect the kids and who's actually perpetrating the violence. So.
Kids need secure attachments, and we're going to talk about child-parent psychotherapy a little bit later on, and one of the complicating factors is that it's probably the best evidence-based treatment for children who've been exposed to domestic violence, but we can't start that treatment until we know that mom can be relatively safe. And the reason we can't is because we're building a secure attachment that teaches the child that the world is safe and that I can depend on my mom and she can protect me. So if I start treatment and I'm teaching my baby that the world is safe and I can protect you, and then I get beat up in front of you or locked out of the house and I'm not there or what have you, it undermines treatment to the point where it's not going to be successful.
And in fact, she'll be called out for not participating or not being successful in the program, and that'll be used against her. I testify in a lot of TPR trials where I wish I had understood that because I was the nail in the coffin a lot of the time because I misunderstood what I was seeing.
Opportunities for serve and return, I'm going to show you that a little bit more later on, and then basic needs. So those are kind of some of the basic things that infants and toddlers need. Serve and return is really important because it shapes brain circuitry. And I'm going to show you a short snippet because these are really good. And these people have great accents and they're from Harvard and things like that, so they sound so much better than I do describing it. But serve and return is a really simple thing that gets interrupted a lot. So when you're in the high chair, the baby drops it, you pick it up, you gave it to the baby, that's serve and return. And we don't recognize how important that is for future learning. But the Harvard Center does, so.
The key to forming strong brain architecture is what's known as serve and return interaction with adults. In this developmental game, new neural connections form in the brain as young children instinctively serve through babbling, facial expressions, and gestures. And adults return the serve, responding in a very directed, meaningful way. It starts very early in life, when a baby coos and the adult interacts and directs the baby's attention to a face or hand. This interaction forms the foundation of brain architecture upon which all future development will be built. It helps create neural connections between all the different areas of the brain, building the emotional and cognitive skills children need in life. For example, here's how it works for literacy and language skills. When the baby sees an object, the adult says its name. This makes connections in the baby's brain between particular sounds and their corresponding objects. Later, adults show young children that those objects and sounds can also be represented by marks on a page. With continued support from adults, children then learn how to decipher writing and eventually to write themselves. Each stage builds on what came before. Ensuring that children have adult caregivers who consistently engage in serve and return interaction, beginning in infancy, builds a foundation in the brain for all the learning, behavior, and health that follow.
Can you think in your cases about, or when we've been discussing, how that might get interrupted if I'm in a relationship where there's domestic violence? You think about the little boy and the exploration that he did. What did he stop doing when the angry person was there? He wouldn't do the beads, right? So he stopped the exploration. And again, the serve and return stops. She shows him how to do it. He's doing it back. Those kind of behaviors stop. And in a snapshot again, in an isolated incident, you might think, well, so they don't play together as much. But really, that's laying the foundation for language, for relationships, for social interactions, and their brain development. So in a snapshot in preschool children, these are some things that you might see when children are exposed to domestic violence. They may worry about being hurt, have nightmares. They frequently feel like they caused the fighting. And that's not always because they've been told so, but little kids are very egocentric. They believe that they make the world happen the way it is, and they do. Christine in our office had a little baby, and she was at a meeting, and I was watching him, and I found myself barefoot walking up and down our hallway for like 25 minutes, and I thought, how can this like tiny little person has gotten me? I put away my phone, I put away everything, and I'm walking up and down the hallway with Ike for 25 minutes. Nobody else could have gotten me to do that, right? So they might have confusion about the unpredictable behavior. They may attempt to make the victim feel better and try to stop the fighting. They may have excessive tantrums, tune out or withdraw, and have fears about separation. We're going to talk specifically about trauma symptoms, and you have that list in there, but it's really important to know what's normal. So there's this wide variation in development, and it's important for you to be aware when you're meeting with a child or seeing a child or reading a report, what does a 2-year-old look like? And I think what happens, and this happens for me, I have the Staying on Track app on my phone from the Early Development Network. When I see 2-year-olds, what kind of 2-year-olds do I see? Generally, if I'm in my office or when I'm practicing, I see 2-year-olds who've been exposed to drugs, domestic violence, chronic neglect, or abuse. That development is usually very different than what normal healthy development is. So I've got to constantly be checking on what that is. This is also important because you look at this list and you say, well, preschool kids tantrum. That's what they do. So it's really important for you to know what's normal for a 2-year-old. How many times should they be pushing the limits and having a tantrum, and what's excessive? So that app is really helpful. And just kind of keeping in mind, if you're around those kinds of kids, what's normal, that this is what it looks like. So we're going to apply this to a case, and this is actually Jamie's case from Florida, but we thought this might be the most helpful way and maybe less boring than us going through lists of 500 symptoms and saying, babies do this and babies do that. But you can find that whole list of trauma symptoms in your folder, and you can go to the Early Development Network's website, or if you put that app on there, or you can get a wheel. There's about 1,000 places that you can find developmental resources that tell you what's normal for babies for physical development, social emotional development, and motor development.
It's good to see that other professions use wheels or wheels.
Yeah.
As much as we do. I think if I pronounce my H's, you guys might listen more. My wheels. So when Jennie and I were talking, we were saying, gosh, we have an awful lot of slides here. But not only do we have an awful lot of slides, we have an awful lot of bullet points. And my twin sister is a full-time faculty, and she teaches public speaking. And she told me, if you ever feel like you're overwhelmed by your bullet points, your audience is going to be overwhelmed by you. So we talked about how can we sort out a way to kind of demonstrate a lot of what we're talking about. And I still have this case, gosh, that was from, I'm getting old, that was almost 7 years ago. And my heart still plunges when I think about that case. You all have those, you guys have those couple of cases where there's just that moment. So we actually call this the MBW case. The case is now closed, so we can reference the actual case name. So MBW stands for Michelle Brito Williams. Michelle Brito Williams is the mother. She was in her early to mid-20s when I first met her, and she ended up having 4 total children, one of whom was already TPR'd when I inherited the case, one who was currently born and was 2 years old when I got the case, and then 2 other children subsequently born as the case was open. Okay, so we're talking 4 babies, 3 of whom I'm familiar with. And so why we're talking about this case is because we really want to see how children are reacting, what some of the symptoms are of domestic violence in the home, because as Jennie's saying, you got to know what child development is, and I'm like, you got to know what domestic violence is. We got to know a lot of stuff, but it's really key. So let's talk about Monica. Monica is the second born child. She's the child who was 2 going on 3 when I met her. She's the oldest then of the 3 children in the home. She was removed twice in my work on the case. She was removed at about 2.5 years old, returned at about 3.5, and then subsequently removed again at age 7. So this case was the case, and I'm not kidding, this was the case that we picked when we started implementing the Safe and Together model. As David Mandel, who's the guy who does it, he came to us. We were one of 3 pilot sites in Florida, and he said, pick the worst case you've got. You know how you have those? The ones that you spend MDT with, the ones that you talk to law enforcement with. Pick it, and we're going to get through it. So we said, fine, we'll pick MBW, and we still call it the case today. So MBW is a case where mom is neglectful. Mom refuses to participate in a variety of services, and mom is high. Mom is also suffering from severe mental health issues. So those are really the key issues that we have on the case when she's a 2.5-year-old. And then what we see is Monica, and I think you've got the clicker. Yeah. So Monica at age 2, so the reason I know Monica at the time is because I actually taught parenting. I taught parenting to parents who were in the child welfare system as a part of their ongoing services regimen, okay? And so Monica and mom, Michelle, present to my parenting class, and I actually taught them all three courses of parenting that were even available. So I actually had them in parenting for 3 years. Judges, maybe don't give us 3 years in a row of the same family. But so let's talk about Monica. Monica only played in parallel. She did not make eye contact with other kids. She would turn her, so if Jennie and I are playing, she would turn her back to the other kids and participate in her activities. She had what I would qualify as excessive tantrums, things where she was doing damage destructively to the home, tearing light bulbs, trying to break light bulbs out of the light bulb sockets, things like that. She frequently would hit, slap, spit on others. She would kick them. She had intense sibling rivalry when the infant came. She reverts, the thing I noticed the most was that she reverted to baby talk a lot. So whereas she was competent to say words and to articulate things well, she would point and go, or she'd go, I want, she would just really revert back. And then the thing that really struck me about Monica was the day that we were doing self-portraits, and Monica sat under the table with a blanket over it with the lights down because that was the only way you could get her to sit. And she cut, so everyone got a paper plate. She actually cut an oval out of that paper plate to resemble her face. She found a big, fat, black crayon and scribbled as hard. I mean, she was just ferociously, this was her face, coloring that black oval. And I looked at her and I said, what is that? And she goes, me. And I said, what do you mean me? She goes, that's my spirit. Okay.
So if we think about what normally at age 2 Monica should be doing, she should be walking, running, climbing, stacking blocks, feeding herself with a spoon. Those are the physical developments. Intellectually, she should have a rapidly growing vocabulary, using 2 to 3 word sentences. Please and thank you. She should like pretend play, and she should like to look at picture books. She should be able to imitate parent actions. She loves to say no. She should be showing independence. Might have difficulty remembering rules, but she likes to explore. Some temper tantrums, sometimes aggressive, at times may slap or hit, may act shy around strangers, and may refer to herself by name.
I should tell you that Monica saw a golden retriever who just had puppies, which, hello, cutest thing ever. And most kids are, oh, I want to pet him, I want to touch him, maybe too much so. Monica pointed across the parking lot at the golden retriever and screamed at it. And I couldn't really understand what she was saying, but the gist of it was basically the golden retriever was parenting the pups at the time, lactating, licking the pups, and it turned her ferocious, angry, vicious, crying, upset. And there was really nothing that any real adult could do to soothe her. And she was 2.5.
So what we saw in Monica was these trauma symptoms. So we know she was withdrawn, she's not playing with other kids, she's putting the blanket over the top, demanding attention through extreme positive or negative behaviors. So she's having the tantrums. Poor verbal skills, we saw that when she's not, she's using the baby talk and she's regressing. Aggressive behaviors, the slapping, the hitting, the light bulbs. Memory problems you sometimes see, or sleep difficulties. Again, those would be above and beyond what's normal for 2, so you should know what's normal for 2. A fear of adults. You also sometimes see poor appetite, screaming or crying, irritability, sadness, and anxiety, and you see a kid that startles easily. So if we think back to the description that Jamie gave of Monica, is it kind of clear that she's fitting into those symptoms? And this is the first removal. By 7, this is where she's at.
So I will just tell one brief story to explain, because then we have the rest of her trauma symptoms listed. Monica is an incredibly artistic, creative child. I mean, she really has a tremendously beautiful spirit despite everything she was exposed to. And Monica one time wanted to learn how to braid. It's super cute. So she asked me to pull out all this ribbon, so I teach her how to braid, and together we kind of work together and we braid this really long thing. And she's really proud of herself, and what an incredible moment for Monica. Then she wraps it around her neck and tries to hang herself with it. I went from being one of my better days to one of my worst days. I think what's really important are some of the other activities listed here that are reminiscent of that. That's her attempt to jump into the canal. God bless Florida, we have canals everywhere, and when you're teaching parenting or when you're supervising parenting, they can run out and just try to jump in a canal. So those types of really self-abusive behaviors were evident at age 7. So, you can go through the rest of them if you want. I don't know.
Okay. So these are trauma symptoms that would be typical for age 7. She's acting out in social situations, and you're seeing some of that leading up to that. Acting withdrawn, still having temper tantrums, verbally abusive. Somatic complaints are really common in this age group. Somatic complaints are, my stomach always hurts, my head always hurts, I've always got some physical problem. These are the kids that are going to be in the nurse's office at school all the time, and they have some kind of unexplainable, unidentified illness or injury. Lack of self-confidence. You see a lot of times regression developmentally, so they've had a skill and they've lost it.
Monica wet herself often during times of high stress. Times where things were status quo, maybe she had been living with mom for a while, she would be fine. But as soon as we removed her again at age 7, and she was only having visitation with mom, which was sporadic at best, she would wet all the time. So very, very succinct with the schedule of whether or not she saw her mom, or whether or not things had kind of hit a constant kind of routine for her.
Between the ages of 2 and 7 and the second removal, what do you notice about her trauma symptoms?
The same.
Did they get any better? No, despite some intervention, right? So Jamie's teaching parenting, she's working with, the kids, but the issue is that she's remaining in that environment.
Right, and so we have the case for the better part of 4 years. So in the time that I was from parenting, I was actually managing all the operations for our ongoing department. So that means family support, that means direct supervision, that means supervised visitation, that obviously means all our full case management department. So the entire group, all 82 of us, right? So I still had very close tabs on this case and kind of watched it as we went through. You better believe I threw everything I had at this case. That little girl is precious and worth my time and my energy. We did dyadic therapy, we did behavior observations, we did parenting, we did drug treatment. We shipped mom and kids all the way up to Miami, which is 154 miles at 45 miles an hour on one-lane road, to go to drug treatment with the kids. I mean, we ran them through the gamut. But something was wrong because nothing was changing with regards to Monica's symptoms, which tells me that something about her environment wasn't changing. And like I said, this was the pivotal case. This is where we were at the moment we said, man, we really need to start doing something different. Because for 5 years, we had this case open the entire 5 years. It never closed. Just because we were unified didn't mean we were ever able to close it. That judge wasn't willing to do that, and probably rightly so.
So if we look at the younger kids, Robert's removed first between 18 and 30 months, and then removed again at 36 months. So we'll go through kind of what his symptoms are at 18 months.
I actually called Robert a good baby once. I think Jennie would have slapped me about 7 years ago if I'd have known better. Robert was a good baby. He sat in his car seat. He rarely fussed. He was a gem to transport. He wasn't dumping his milk everywhere in your back seat. But at the same time, when kids are not making eye contact with you and participating in what we call that serve and return, you start to go, something's a little off here. But most of the time when I would hear his guardian ad litem or his service providers refer to him, they almost always just called him, he's the good baby, because you compare him to Monica. Monica she actually ran up over the top of my car, jumping in canals, trying to hang herself with nooses. And then you've got this guy. Very rarely fusses, very quiet. But what we're here to tell you today is that it actually is a trauma symptom.
Right, so by 36 months, this is what you're seeing with him. Overly aggressive, screeching instead of talking. He's freezing and goes off to hide when he's around men.
Yeah, he was in a group home for a period of time across the street from where I taught parenting, and obviously it's a male and a female couple who are the house parents, and whenever the male would walk in, he would, noticeably, you didn't have to be a rocket scientist, he would freeze, he would look away, so he'd avert his gaze, and then usually when I would come in shortly after, I would find him under the coffee table, or I'd find him kind of off in the corner, or he'd actually be trying to climb in his playpen. Not typical of a 2-year-old.
Do you want to talk a little bit about having to put him in his playpen?
Yes. Unfortunately, so when you're in a group setting, you obviously are around and exposed to other children. And in fact, at this point in time, we had other infants in that group home. God bless the group home parents. But one of the things that Robert did was he was really destructive and dangerous. Babies pinch each other, they'll bite, they'll mouth it, they'll do these things. But he was actually doing it trying to destruct. When you would take him away, he would ferociously try to get back at these kids. So unfortunately, Robert, they didn't have a much better intervention at the time, but then to put him in his playpen. And so he spent a lot of time there. And I remember walking out one day, we subcontracted with them, and so I walked out and he was holding on to the edge of the playpen. I had mom with me, his mom, and he just stood there quiet as a mouse in that playpen and just tears. That's all he did. He just stood there and his face did this. He had such a profound little face. And so, yeah, but he was so dangerous to the other babies, he couldn't be trusted around them.
So when we talk about trauma symptoms, you can see that he's displaying a lot of these. He's having excessive tantrums. He's anxious. He's fearful and avoidant. He's aggressive. He's fearing separation. And he's having developmental regression. Normally, these are the things that he would be doing. So at 36 months, he would have an average vocabulary of 896 words. Robert's not there because he's a good baby and nobody talks to him because he's quiet and he doesn't make a fuss. And he's got 2 siblings, one who's a newborn that we'll talk about in a little bit, and then the 7-year-old who's causing all of this. He should know his body parts. He can talk in short sentences. Social emotional functioning at 36 months. He should enjoy being with other children, and what we're seeing are those trauma symptoms where he's acting out. He should begin to show cooperation, which doesn't sound like at 36 months very cooperative when you're having to be in a playpen.
Is that less abnormal?
Yes, this would be normal development. We just kind of want to give you a snapshot. I won't run through all of them, but how different his development is. And so Susan's here from EDN, and I'll make my plug that I always do, but that's why it's so important that kids are having those early development network evaluations, because what you are seeing is kids who are not on a normal developmental trajectory. They aren't able to do these things, and instead they're displaying these trauma symptoms and behaviors that Jamie's talking about, and without intervention, it doesn't just get better.
And honestly, some of these things are extreme, and that's why that case came to mind. And a lot of the other cases that you're going to see, it's a lot more subtle. We're going to find out why the kids are behaving this way in a minute. But in other cases, it's very hard to see. One of our quality assurance manager would do ages and stages on her 3 boys because she would honestly forget what her 3 boys should be doing, because we're truly exposed to children who are kind of underperforming in their developmental stages. And so we forget what it looks like. We almost forget how to measure it. And unfortunately, when we're trying to do things like determine nexus, determine whether or not to remove, how impactful are some of these maltreatments on the kids, and we don't have this developmental side of it, I guess at a certain point I'm just guessing. And so when we did do ages and stages with the kids, we said, holy crap. Okay.
Yeah, and I think it was back in another slide, but really having some kind of developmental screening is important. I can find you the reference, but there was a study that they did of pediatricians, and they had them look at babies and try to determine whether or not they had a developmental delay with a formal screening like ages and stages and without. And 45% of the time, pediatricians missed a developmental delay without using a screening. There's so much going on in these first 5 years that being able to put eyes on a baby for 10 minutes and say that that baby is on track developmentally is nearly impossible. It's impossible for pediatricians, it's impossible for therapists, it's impossible for EDN. They need to have some time to screen and they need to have lots of information. So then we have Richard, who's the baby.
Richard presents a very unique and it's a great dichotomy between what can happen with a child when they have a secure attachment and what the challenge is when they don't have a secure attachment and are being exposed to trauma. Richard, so both Monica and Robert, the first two kids, had the same dad. And Richard was born in a new relationship that mom had. So we got first guy. He's out of the house. He's no longer able to be physically violent with the kids, all this stuff. So we're thrilled. Well, so new dad comes along. They have this baby, Richard. Richard gets removed at 18 months. That 7-year removal for Monica, they're all the same. It's all the same time together, okay, that they're removed. But the difference between Richard and the other kids is that with new dad, he has a really strong relationship with his paternal grandmother. And so we actually have a true dichotomy between what I would see with Richard when he was with me or my staff and what we would see when my staff would actually go deposit him at paternal grandma's house. And so I was still supervising the supervised visits and the support team at that point. And so I was getting direct feedback from my support team with notes and observations. And then I was getting direct feedback and observations from my caseworkers who are working with mom and baby. So I actually saw two babies. I actually at some point was wondering which of my team needed to be fired or better trained or what. And so when we had Richard in the context of mom, we saw frequently left in his car seat. He was frequently unchanged. He absolutely did not make eye contact. You ever try to kiss your dog at home and the dog goes, Richard, when you try to do serve and return with him, he would turn away, he would try to turn his body, these types of things. He never explored things with his mouth. I found that really interesting. Most babies are chewing on you. He never did that, and he didn't want to play with my necklace. I never had to worry about my glasses around him. He made not a sound. It's not a sound. Not even a screech, not a babble, silent. And then, I don't know what stilling is.
Stilling is the freezing.
Oh, yes,
so
and he would freeze. Thank you. Mm-hmm. See, I'm learning things. And then what he would do is actually the second any new adult walked in, he would freeze in his car seat. So that was the Richard that I knew. And then I insisted on going out with my staff because I had to see this other baby. When we dropped Richard off with paternal grandma, babbling, instant serve and return, making eye contact. He would grab her necklace and suck on it, and she told me that he did that. She's like, yes, this is his favorite necklace. And I'm going, he has never even made an attempt. I've never heard a sound out of him. But then he also react when she turns away. So when we were participating in the separation, he would lose it. He would cry. I mean, just like most babies, they'd cry, they'd be upset, they'd have some separation anxiety. That was very normal and reasonable. I never saw him cry or be upset when I separated him from his mom. So two very different babies, but two very different attachments.
So these are the things that he should have been doing, and you see that he did those things with grandma, exploring objects with his mouth. He should be able to recognize mother, but in this case it was grandma. Loves to be touched and held, coos, giggling, make lots of sounds, and recognizes face. So he's adapting to behavior with mom, and because of the attachment, he looks like a completely different baby. We found that when we did these Safe Start assessments with parents, where we looked at development, and we did a developmental screening, and then we did something called the Kroll assessment, which I'm going to show you a little bit later. If we did it sometimes with one parent and another parent, we saw completely different results because of the attachment. And because of the parents' ability sometimes to respond because of their own trauma, too.
Oh, you added another great picture. I love that. Okay, and so we're getting ready thank you.
I think we switch off a little bit.
Okay.
Again, it's our first time.
We've never done this.
This is our second time meeting, our first time doing this. So
I met her for an hour last week, so it's great. So now we've talked to you, we've kind of impressed upon you, please know about this, please know about this, please know about this, please have some insight about what you know, what you don't know. Because it's a very humbling experience to say, oh my gosh, there's a possibility that my lack of knowledge in this area or my staff's lack of knowledge in this area, or, especially as you're up the chain in the child welfare system. So if you're a judge, and we'll talk about this in a minute, or if you're a county attorney, or if you're a supervisor, you're reliant on the information that you're getting. My hope is that what you're hearing is, oh my gosh, I might not be getting quite the information that I'm needing to make a fair and useful assessment about the safety and well-being of a child who's in the home. And that's not anyone's fault. Like I said, the assumption today is that everyone is doing a really great job. The idea of this is to kind of nuance and supplement some of the information and expertise you already have so that we can hope to do things that are going to help children actually start to thrive in our system by providing the correct and appropriate interventions. So one of the first things that we're going to do is we're going to see kind of one more video. Are we going to show it?
Yeah, I think we have to.
Yep, I think so too. To see kind of what domestic violence is having an impact on for older youth, but then also we're going to talk about that kind of in a universal context as well. So I think we're going to fire this thing. Do I hit play?
I think we have to do it this way.
Okay.
So, and a lot of you have probably been to, have you heard the term toxic stress before? So toxic stress is stress that is continual, that kids cannot get out of. Situations like domestic violence, substance abuse, chronic neglect. It's not, I gotta, go get your bottle ready so you cry for a couple of minutes, but then I come back. This is chronic, prolonged stress that kids can't get out of.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
Make your hand like this. This is your basic functioning, like your breathing, your heart, your what have you, and your brainstem. This is the emotional regulation part, and this top part of your brain is that prefrontal cortex. It's the part that uses your experiences to kind of make decisions. When I had teenagers, I would say it's the part that, they run and jump off a dock, and I would run and be like, the water is kind of cold, I wonder how deep it is. I've heard a story one time about someone breaking their neck. All those things that your mother told you that flood into your brain when you do things, or those kind of messages that you learn from experience. What happens to kids that are traumatized and experience toxic stress is this part of the brain, which is not developed fully until you're in your late 20s, is kind of like Dr. Segal says, they flip their lid. So they're always operating here. They're always operating from the emotion part of their brain. They're always operating from the place where they can't reason. So they're unpredictable and they can't regulate their emotions. And so what we saw in Monica, because she's experienced this chronic kind of environment, this chronic toxic stress, is by the time she gets to 7, she's completely out of control. And it's not for lack of trying to put in parenting interventions and what have you, but she can't learn those things. It's physically impossible for her to learn to regulate at that point because she's always like this. She's not able to access that part of her brain. So the problem with that is that Monica grows up to be what? She grows up to be impulsive. She grows up to usually be a mother, right? And she's like this all the time. So she's not able to access that, thinking part of her brain. She's not able to make these good decisions. And when I say not able, I mean not able. It's not that she's unwilling sometimes, it's that she is completely unable to do those things.
It can't be taught?
It can be taught, can be worked on, but you have to integrate trauma experiences, you have to learn to self-regulate. So all these things that happen during the first 5 years when your brain is primed and ready to learn those things, it'd be like you and I learning a foreign language right now. It's going to take me a significantly longer portion of time than it would during a sensitive period. So those first 5 years, you have all of these sensitive periods for learning, for language, for attachment, and your brain is primed and ready to go. The environment is feeding you all this and you learn all these things. It takes longer later on. And you have to have somebody who's got available resources to do so. So if they're continuing in a relationship like that and I'm going to trauma therapy, I'm probably not going to get much out of it if I'm thinking when I get home from trauma therapy after I took the car, this is not going to go well. They have to, it's pretty challenging. That's why it's really important that we intervene early.
So in Richard's case, is it correct to assume that his development will turn out better than Monica's because he had the paternal grandmother as
Yes.
identified
Yes.
caregiver?
The question was, in Richard's case, is it safe to assume that his development will be better because of the paternal grandmother? And absolutely. So he's got a secure attachment. He may not be learning those things with mom. He may not be getting that serve and return from mom, but he's getting it from somebody. He's getting it from somewhere. And so he's going to be learning those skills, accessing that. That's a buffer and a protective factor from the stress. So.
And that it really is a beautiful, when Jennie and I were getting together and we're like, how can we make these two things work? Well, there's no way around it. These two things have to work together. Child development, the impacts of trauma, and so now it's not raining. We've changed our white noise to thunder, lightning, and Jamie's drive home here in a little bit.
Jamie's body looks like the Harvard development video right now.
I know, I'm like, crap, I've already driven 3 hours in this once today. But so, and actually I have a slide that makes my point. It's amazing how that happens. I was really thinking this through. Domestic violence just can't be about the children. And so Jennie and I have talked about, we've identified areas that children are obviously being very impacted. So you guys as service providers are going, all right, really, now what? So what does the intervention look like? Does this mean that we just remove all the kids from these homes? And we hope that through proper intervention and things like that things get better. And then we also ask, why didn't things for Monica, Richard, and Robert get better in the home? Well, I will tell you, we had people literally in the bushes, looking through windows, working 24 hours a day through the FSWs, through the supervised visits, to hope that things in the home are as stable or as safe as they can be. I will tell you, so we sat down and we said, this is our worst case right now. It's stagnant. We don't know what to do. We're going to pull these kids again. And David Mandel looks at me and he goes, have you identified a real problem yet? He's very nice. And I almost lunged at him across the table because this case has been my life for 5 years and I don't understand what he's trying to ask me. What he's trying to ask me is, you are telling me all of the symptoms. You have not yet identified the problem. So, do we want to know why Monica, Richard, and Robert are exposed to and experiencing severe trauma symptoms? Probably you do. Well, it turns out that pre-domestic violence lens, we had no idea to ask some questions, and we had no idea what was really happening. Well, it turns out that Monica and Robert's father raped her repeatedly. Not only that, he raped her repeatedly while she was pregnant with Robert, so the second child. And so when she had Robert, she had really all these conflicted feelings about him because she had conceived him through rape. Okay? What else was happening in the home? Both dads, both Richard and Robert's dad, raped her repeatedly. That was their prize tactic. They beat her severely. She had a detached retina at one point, so that means that the eyeball actually like popped out and was only hanging on by a thread. That's scary to see, I will tell you. The other tactic is they would keep mom up for days on end. And what that looks like is they actually would berate her through the night. It wasn't just like they kept her awake. It was they kept her awake and they basically emotionally tortured her. Because then what happens during the day? Who's awake? The kids. So can mom sleep while the kids are awake? No wonder when I would show up for my home visit at 7:30 in the morning, mom would still be asleep. And then again at 10, she'd still be asleep. And I would be all judgmental about it, right? All judgy. Look at this mom. I wish I could sleep until 10. These types of things. Well, little did I know, because I wasn't asking the right questions, that mom had just been kept up the entire night. Okay? The number one issue for removal number 2 for Monica at 7 years old was that the only thing that we could really prove as a maltreatment at this point was that educational neglect. That mom refused to take Monica to school. Absolutely refused. And we came to find out that the reason that mom refused to take Monica to school was that the perpetrator would sneak in through the window and hold the baby hostage, so baby Richard, his child, and had said that he will sexually abuse the infant if mom leaves the house. Because mom's going to leave the house with a black eye, and someone's going to notice, and so he's going to actually finally get in trouble for what he's doing. So when I'm looking at mom, I'm looking at her behavior. I haven't really looked at her intent. I'm prescribing intent to her refusal. I'm saying mom refused to take the girl to school, therefore it's educational neglect. They filed the first truancy petition ever filed in Monroe County, Florida, because they wanted to sort out a way to intervene. But what we didn't do is we didn't say, why is mom not taking the 7-year-old to school? Instead we said, can you believe she's still dating this guy? So mom is protecting her infant child from being sexually molested by the child's father. The scariest part about this case is not all of the abuse, believe it or not. The scariest part about the case was that the judge placed the kids with the perpetrator. He was the non-offending parent in the petition. He was the number one preferred placement because the children knew him, he had a stable house, he had a job, but he was also sexually abusing the baby, berating the mother in front of the children, keeping her up for days at a time. She also had challenges with lactation with the baby. There's a reason the baby stayed in the car seat. The baby stayed in the car seat because that was the safest place for the baby to be. Okay, but so I didn't know any of that. The department didn't know any of that. So our best intervention was one that kept the children in the same toxic environment. Subsequently, we see the same toxic symptoms, but we hadn't yet identified the problem, which in this case was domestic violence.
What year was this case?
Pardon?
What year was this?
The year I inherited it was 2009. The case opened in 2007. No, the case opened in 2005 when Monica was first born. It was we call those red flag cases in Florida. One of the ones where they put the little flag somewhere magically in the file that says if this kid's born, you call us right away. Reason being, she was identified because the child had been TPR'd prior, the older child. So she was automatically what we call a red flag case. Mm-hmm.
I believe you mentioned earlier there are 2 dads.
Yes.
And which dad were you talking about in terms of placing all 3 kids?
The newest dad, baby Richard's father. It doesn't help that she named her kids like all ours. It does make that confusing. Yeah. So it was the non-offending newest parent because older prior dad was actually serving some time in jail for cocaine trafficking. Okay. So the main point here is, the main takeaway is that domestic violence cases can't really just be all about the kids. It really has to be also about that parent, about that protective parent, because this is where you're going to get your best servant in return. This is where kids are going to really be resilient. Google resiliency in children and you will see it's that single adult attachment. If they have that, they're going to get through their lifetime a lot better. How many foster homes do you think Monica has since been through? 19. So do you think Monica has been able to heal and thrive after her trauma? Nope. Okay, so we need to make sure that kids are safer and resilient with their protective parent. We also need to support the parents that are protective to ensure better outcomes for the children, because 19 foster homes just simply isn't cutting it. Okay, and the two aren't mutually exclusive, so that means that you can't have child safety and resiliency without necessarily worrying about that protective parent. Okay, so why do I care so much about this? Why do I care so much that children need to be looked at as a part of their protective parent? Because these kids, as Jenny mentioned, are going to be adults very soon. How many of you guys have a case where the parent was in the system prior as a child? Right? We all have them. You're like, yeah, she really had a tough life. She had a really tough go of it. Yes, she did. And we have an opportunity here to really intervene, especially if we can identify the domestic violence early, unlike what we did for Monica, unlike what I did for Robert and Richard. I really dropped the ball. We as a system dropped the ball. So when we're looking, and David Mandel says to me, Jamie, tell me what the real problem is, because all I hear are symptoms. Some of these symptoms are legitimate. This is CDC data for us. The CDC really cares about domestic violence because domestic violence is single-handedly the most expensive crime in the United States. And that's not just based on work productivity. That's actually only a fraction of the cost. The number one most expensive thing are the resultant medical visits, the treatment required for survivors of violence. So what are survivors of violence facing when the relationship, let's say the relationship ends and the environment subsides and the tornado is gone? That doesn't mean that they're just going to be awesome parents ready to be a part of some of these great therapies that Jenny is talking about. They're going to be having some long-term consequences, as are the children. So domestic violence victims tend to face about, you can tell this is done by the CDC because they have huge ranges, but they're still very pertinent ranges. So mid-50s to high 80% suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. We see mid-60s to high 70% experience depression, and 38 to 75% experiencing things like anxiety. So when I'm trying to parent, when I'm trying to create a nurturing, loving environment for my children, and I'm potentially, in the majority of cases, suffering from PTSD or suffering from severe anxiety or depression, this isn't like I feel bad today depression. This is chronic. This is potentially substantial. Other symptoms for long-term chronic domestic violence survivors, things like flashbacks, sleep disturbances. Any of you guys gone for a period of time on a little bit of sleep? That would be me today, and you're just like, oh. So one of the challenges of healing is your body actually can't completely heal because you suffer from so many flashbacks or sleep disturbances. You also have a lot of emotional detachment. So when we talk about wanting to bond with your child, wanting to heal that relationship, but one of the biggest challenges is that I've since withdrawn or detached. It's very challenging for depressed parents, exhausted parents, to parent effectively, especially when you're dealing with a 7-year-old like Monica who's highly traumatized and takes the work of an army, a clinical army, to be able to parent her. And then we look at the mom and all the things that she's experiencing mental health-wise. We're asking a lot of her. So then we look at sexual violence. A lot of times people assume domestic and sexual violence are completely separate. About 40 to 44% of our domestic violence victims anecdotally express sexual violence, that they have some point in time in their relationships been raped. So if almost half of our domestic violence survivors have been raped, you're not just looking at domestic violence symptoms, you're looking at a double whammy for sexual violence symptoms. These are heart-wrenching things. 3 times more likely to suffer from depression, 6 times more likely to suffer from PTSD, 13 times more likely to abuse alcohol, staggeringly 26 times more likely to abuse substances, and then of course, and very sadly, 4 times more likely to contemplate suicide. So when we're talking about appropriate interventions, we really have to be very sensitive that not only are we looking at the immediate trauma that's happening in the home, but we also are going to be seeing a lot of other symptoms. So a case might actually get called in, and almost always will, for something more related to things like substance abuse. We might also see a negligent parent, but we may not, just like with the MBW case, we may be just seeing the symptoms on the surface without really cracking the code as to what's really impacting that environment. Because if we aren't changing the environment, we're going to continue to see chronic trauma exposure.
Do we have data on kids who grew up in domestic violence, sexual violence, becomes adult to be perpetrator? Or
Yeah, I get asked that question a lot. That's a really great question. I think a lot of people here want to know, and potentially for nexus purposes, but also just inquisitively. They want to know, are people who grow up in these homes more likely or less likely to perpetrate violence? The answer is there's no causation between perpetrators between perpetrators today who experience violence actually perpetrating it later on in life. The only thing that we know is that of the current population of perpetrators, many of them have a physical violence history, trauma history. That is the one causation they have kind of seen over the last decade. So just because you have been exposed to domestic violence does not mean that you are more or less likely to perpetrate it. And I think that that's a really hopeful piece of information. But, pardon?
Not only perpetrator, but become a victim.
I think that that's a potential assumption. One of the things that we see anecdotally from, if there were one silver bullet to what causes someone to be a perpetrator and what caused someone to be a victim, we would have sorted this problem out forever ago, right? We wouldn't still be dealing with this today. I wouldn't be being paid to stand in front of you or anything like that. So there isn't any one thing. But I will say that children who are exposed to chronic trauma have, one of the symptoms we saw was lower self-esteem, right? People who have lower self-esteem have the propensity to want to find value in others, by others, from others, and so that can potentially make them more likely to be exposed to a bad relationship, but it's really impossible to say that, because what did we say? How many people in here wanted a relationship? How many people wanted a relationship where you got hit, slapped, punched, spit on? When women are looking for a partner and they're looking right at a perpetrator, they're not seeing the violence yet. So they're not exactly shopping around for these guys. These guys are actually shopping around for them. And the best way that I can explain that is to say that perpetrators of domestic violence, the best way to compare them is to a sex predator. And this is not an exaggeration. This is not hyperbole. I'm from rural Maine. We are not prone to hyperbole in rural Maine. You get the facts, and the facts it. So I kind of lost my thought because now I'm thinking about Maine and our accents and how we say H's with our W's and things like that. But so perpetrators are like sex predators in the sense that they groom, in the sense that no 4-year-old who got sexually abused by grandpa signed up for it. No victims who are perpetrated on by these guys sign up for that perpetration. We also know that these guys have more than one victim. I have a gentleman in my office right now. He has 6 protection orders against him over the course of his 15 years in Hastings. So he has 6 different victims. So much like sex predators, there's a reason we put them on a registry, okay? There's a reason why people are like putting signs up in driveways. I mean, they're taking this stuff pretty seriously. It's because that they're going to be more likely than not to have more than one victim. Perpetrators don't just pick you and say, I'm perpetrating on you. They're going to perpetrate in every relationship. And you're not going to see that necessarily with you. The number one tactic that perpetrators employ with the child welfare system is to be kind, caring, compassionate, and I'm just doing this to help her and fix her. The number one thing that you know about a perpetrator is they never blame themselves, they always blame their victim. Well, it's her, she's crazy. I actually had a guy come in the other day to tell me he was a victim, but it's because his wife just wouldn't leave him alone. If you are feeling beat down and you have low self-esteem, you're probably not going to come in knowing exactly that someone else is to blame for your problems. You're going to be blaming yourself. So I've kind of explained that there's no answer to your question in a lot of words. Okay, so we actually are on point number 6, believe it or not, which is promising because that means we're going to be getting out of here soon. Yay! No, we have a couple though. This is point 6, but this is perhaps one of the most important points and really one of the things that Jenny and I want you to walk away from today. While I'm a huge proponent of doing better casework for domestic violence, I'm just a huge proponent of doing better casework, full stop. How we treated that domestic violence case with MBW, when we rolled out Safe and Together, sure, it impacts the majority of our cases, but more importantly than that, by asking better questions, by making sure we're not subscribing intent to behavior, so the next time a mom doesn't take her kid to school, I'm looking at the case and going, I wonder what the barriers are to this mom taking her kid to school. I'm not going, that lazy mom just doesn't want to be up before 11. Okay, so this isn't just about domestic violence. This should be about how we do kind of all of our casework. Okay. So Jenny and I are now going to start getting into the prescriptive, what I would call the prescriptive part of our presentation, which is what now? God, you do a great job with your pictures.
Thanks.
I gotta get on your hard drive. Okay, so we're gonna talk a little bit about this, but I'll just kind of introduce it conceptually first, which is, so the reason why child welfare exists, right, the history of it is this, that we identified that children were not given a fair shot at it. We called those things maltreatments, right? We said it's physical violence, whatever. And so we had determined that obviously there's a maltreatment going on in the home, therefore something in the environment is awry, and we need to put a service there, or services, in order to address the dysfunction in that home and turn it back to stable and homeostatic, right? That's the idea. But I will tell you that the problem or the challenge with doing what we call services-driven services is that they don't actually necessarily guarantee a change in behavior. And so what the Safe and Together model and what domestic violence lens services call for are actually behavior-driven services. So if you've ever worked with a perpetrator, perpetrators are fabulous in the DVIP or BIP programs. I oversee our men's group program. And one of the things that they're great at doing is attending 36 sessions every week, Tuesday nights, 6 to 7:30, and they check that box off. The night that one of the guys finished class a couple weeks ago, he was really proud of himself. I'm going to make all these changes. He dragged his wife around the house by the neck while holding their infant baby laughing. She happened to get it on video. He's going to jail, which is nice. The night he graduated. So just because they're in these programs getting these services doesn't necessarily mean that perpetrators are capable of actually changing their behaviors. When I ask for funding for our men's program, they always ask me, well, how successful is your men's program? The men's program guesses about 3% internationally success in actually changing or seeing manifest change behaviors in perpetrators. And what that really means is, so if they're not necessarily going to change, well, I should say this, how many people have been on a diet? I'm on 6 of them right now. One's cheese, one's bread, and then there's going to be vegetables somewhere in the middle. It just depends on which diet I choose to be on in that moment. Okay, but so we all know that making positive lifestyle changes for ourselves take a lot of time. That's why most DVIP programs or BIP programs are like 9 months apiece. I mean, that's a long time. You can have a baby, right? Actually, I think it's closer to 10 months. That's why I'm still opting for the dog. They tell you 9, but I think they're cutting that a little short. But so one of the challenges is once they finish those classes, they finish that service, what kind of leverage do you have? I did my services. Your case goes stagnant, it goes cold until you can come up with some other really creative reason to put them in some other service because they went to class every week. And that really sucks. That's really, really hard. So you've got judges, you've got county attorneys in here, you've got providers, and everyone has the same feeling of, shoot, he crossed off everything on my case plan. So that's why we need to do it behavior-driven. So this guy who routinely drags this woman around by the neck while holding the baby laughing, while he's participating in behaviors that are hurting the kids, he does things like shake the baby, really terrible stuff. If I were to write that into a case plan, or if I were to include that part in the petition, if I were to look past that police report and have a better global understanding of what's happening in the household, I can actually, every time I do we call them JR, judicial reviews, you guys just have reviews here, I would actually be able to report not just on, yeah, he finished services. I would go, yeah, he finished his service, but he's still dragging his wife around the house by the neck. Or he's still punching holes in the wall. When I did my home visit, there were 3 more holes in the wall, and the child told me that I was his dad. Okay? Then the judge is going to look at that and go, well, what the heck, guy? You finished your service, but you're not changing your behaviors. So when we talk about behavior-driven services, it's not only prescribing them services that might change the behavior, then holding them accountable for those behaviors, it also tells me that you guys actually know what's happening in the home. That means that someone who's making a decision about a life or death scenario with the kid is going to be making it based on what the behaviors are. When Jennie was talking about an environment, what she's talking about is a series of behaviors combined together. That's what an environment is. So if you want to change an environment, you have to change the behaviors that are growing the environment. Does that make sense? Okay. So I'm going to just flash this back up here one more time again. If you're participating in any of these really distracting questions or conversations, I spend hours on the myths about violence, and I'd happily do it, but it's Friday, so we won't. But we need to start really looking at better questions. We need to really make sure that we're starting to monitor cases based on fact, observation, and behaviors rather than on, well, she's high, she's drunk, she's this. Make sure those aren't your symptoms. I'm not saying every case you get now you're going to be like, I found domestic violence. I mean, make sure you understand what the barriers are to treatment. Make sure you understand why they're high. Make sure you understand why they chronically are substance addicted. Has their environment changed at all as a result of your services? Okay? So a couple of things, I'm going to run through it very briefly. The first thing that I would suggest is you guys have fabulous domestic violence programs who are really experts in this area. Our Hastings area, and then a lot of times Lincoln, Beatrice, people who I've trained as a part of the department, I consult with the Family Violence Council, who then subcontracts with the department for me to train. There's a pilot program going on in Lincoln about the Safe and Together model. I've trained a lot of family support workers, like 600 of them.
Have you trained the police yet?
I did visit with the Lincoln Police Department. We did do a training there, but that's kind of as far as it's gotten. And I will talk a little bit about momentum in a minute. But so there are a couple of things that we can be doing, and I'm not talking about the folks who are, necessarily judges or anything like that, but I think that we all have a really important role to play in that, so I really want to make sure that if you're high up or the front line, that you acknowledge that actually some of these suggestions on things that you can do actually applies to everyone in the room. So one of the things that our victims always say is, you're the first person who's ever believed me. One of the reasons why they say that is because every other time they've told anyone about the violence, the person who's listening has tried to figure out what she has done, and not vindictively, but just what did she do? Most therapists will say, well, maybe you should stop nagging him because they want to help solve the problems in the home, but what they're really starting to do is actually blaming the victim for the violence. And if he's in control and she's not, and we're blaming her, have you changed the environment? No. It'd be great if we could just blame the victim and the violence would go away. But if we're not blaming or holding the offender accountable, we haven't done anything to shift the environment. So believing them, trusting that she's the expert. I mentioned those 36 cases where the moms were killed in the exact same way that they had described it in their protection orders. They were the experts. They knew. One key point, and then I'll let you guys read the rest in your slides. This is the second kind of paradigm shift I wanted to walk over with you. And this is not suggesting that anyone is doing anything intentionally, but we actually, in our role in the child welfare system, perpetrate power and control, not in the context of domestic violence, but we utilize our power in an effort to kind of control the dynamics in the household. We used to have to wear Department of Children and Family jackets when we go in to pull kids. I've pulled kids. Why do you think we wear those jackets? To show our authority. Okay. I'm going to be home. I'm going to be asking you to make sure that you're home by 9 so that your kids have the proper routine. Doesn't the perpetrator who's checking her underwear want to make sure she's home at 9 also? So while we're trying to keep kids safe in the home, some of our behaviors actually can mimic those of perpetrators. And so sometimes that can actually trigger some of those PTSD responses, some of those stress and anxiety responses. So you might have an uncooperative mother, but we might actually also just be triggering some of her trauma. So again, it's nothing that we're doing intentionally, but it's something that we need to be made aware of, that as our very role, we are potentially perpetrating on her by demonstrating our authority in the child welfare system over her. Think about it from this perspective. If you don't, we're going to remove your kids. Doesn't he do the same thing? If you don't do what I say, I'm taking your kids. So seeking input from your local domestic violence agency, there's 20 programs in the state of Nebraska and 3 travel programs. We're everywhere. So find out who yours is. The reason I segued into training with the department is because I do consultation calls with them on really difficult cases, and your programs are all able to do that from a hypothetical, confidential standpoint. You don't have to tell us anything about the case. Just ask us some hypotheticals and we can help. And then, of course, connecting her with resources. Nebraska does fatality reviews every year, and the number 1 and 2 predictors of whether or not someone will actually be killed in a potentially lethal incident are 2 things, and 2 things alone that they've found correlations on. 1, did someone help her plan for her safety? And 2, was she given access to resources beyond her own home? Those are the 2 correlating factors in the Nebraska fatality reviews. They've been corroborated by other fatality reviews in other states. Okay, so if nothing else, we can help them plan for their safety and we can give them access to community resources. Why? Number 1 tactic perpetrators like to do, isolation. She needs to know what else is out there. She needs to know that the only resource to her isn't the cans of corn that she's got in the trunk of her car, right?
Can I just add that's
Yeah.
something that you bring up for court cases a lot, and don't publish the safety plan.
Yeah.
You know, we've talked about there's some common sense things that when we start thinking about these cases, you know, the worker wants to know the safety plan, the judge wants, everybody wants to know, does she have a safety plan? And they want to know what it is. Who else also knows what her safety plan is when we give it to all the parties? He does. So if I say my safety plan is I'm going to go here, and then that is in the case plan and court report that that's my safety plan, it's not very safe anymore.
No,
because
you've dug at the scratch, so to speak,
Yeah.
right? And we do talk about that, and so there are going to inevitably be some unresolved questions, some unresolved, well, how are we supposed to do that in Nebraska? You're giving us this pie-in-the-sky approach to child welfare. Well, I'll tell you, we do it, and we do it every day in the state of Florida and in a variety of other states. There's great research published, but that's why I contract with the department now to help kind of walk through some of these barriers. Well, Your Honor, I can't tell you the safety plan, but I promise I have one, right? That's a barrier. That's a hurdle for us to kind of sort out. And I will tell you, we've done it successfully, and we've done it successfully in a lot of places. And what we've actually seen as a result of some of this work is a reduction in recidivism. We saw almost immediately, really in the first 8 months, going into the last 9 months of the reporting period, we saw cases that we would have had 3, 4, 5 calls on typically for that case, 0, because we were actually finding out what was going on in the home and actually treating some of the problems instead of some of the symptoms. And so I respect the fact that Jennie and I hurtling through this information in 3 hours will leave some of those things unresolved, but I promise I have answers. If I don't have answers, I have, well, this is how we messed up, so don't do what I did, okay? So as Jennie brought up, you know, I'm telling you the 2 things that really are big predictors for whether or not someone survives a potentially fatal incident are safety and access to community resources. And actually, those are the 2 things that our grants, the federal level, require us to report on. Are you surveying to make sure that clients feel safer after you're done on a crisis call? And do they feel like they have access or better understanding of their community resources? Those are the 2 things that guarantee us funding if we're doing that well. That's how respected those 2 things are. So, of course, then, I'm going to tackle just very briefly a little bit about safety planning because I can't tell you this is super important, but I'm not going to talk to you about it today. So, the power of information and the no harm principle. I'm going to introduce that as kind of a concept to you. So when we're sitting with our workers or when we're practicing on the bench or when we're talking about how we're going to process cases as an MDT or whatever, one of the things that we want to make sure is that we keep in mind what we call the no harm principle. So my staff every day at SASA, they look at me, and we have a guy right now who's a federal sniper. He's actually a paid sniper for the federal government. And he placed all the kids laying down while they're on their visit in Colorado because she has to drive them to Colorado for visits as ordered. He actually placed all 3 kids, little boys, laying down on their backs with coins on their foreheads and told her, this is how I plan to kill them all. Once I kill them, I'm going to shoot them right through the head and I'm going to put coins on them. But the baby, I plan on killing. When you're holding him and running away from me, I'm going to shoot you through the head and I'm going to make contact with that baby. So then my staff come to me and they go, holy right? I mean, it really was one of the cases that has me kind of up at nights, honestly, because this guy's capable, right? He's got 27 automatic, semi-automatic rifles, I don't know, handguns, whatever. He's got all of these. He's got 27 of them. And not only that, but he holds a license to have them. We obviously are working on all these things. You guys are saying, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you do this? We are doing those things, I promise. But I bring it up because when we're talking about cases and my staff come to me and they say, how the hell do I do this? I always say, what's the no harm principle here? Is our intervention potentially going to do more harm? Okay? And so I really want to keep that in mind, and that goes to what Jennie was mentioning, which is safety planning. Is my safety plan that I'm working on with my survivor or that I'm asking the workers to work on for the case going to actually put her in harm's way? So when a client comes into us and says, I want to do a protection order, we are the only authorized agency in our 4-county area who can assist with a protection order. Okay? And that's great because then we get a lot of victims in. Yay! And so they will say, I think I want to do a protection order. And we say, well, tell me more about that. And they say, well, you know, I think I've been told that this restraining order, it'll keep them away from me for 500 feet. It means they've been watching too much CSI. I wish they worked that way. But anyway, so we'll process with them and we will ask them, has he ever been involved with law enforcement before, yes or no? If yes, how does he like law enforcement? Oh, he's got the police playing in his car all the time. He doesn't care about law enforcement. He has no respect for the law. Protection order, all it is a piece of paper. I don't know if you've seen one lately. And it's only as good as its name. It's not going to stop a bullet. It's not going to stop a knife. It's not going to stop 2 hands around my neck. So if he has zero respect for law enforcement, telling her to get a protection order might actually be causing her more harm than not. And the reason why and how you look at the no harm principle is this, and only this. Domestic violence is about power and control, okay? It's I know you heard this from me, but this is the most important thing I'm going to say today. Domestic violence is about power and control. Our system represents an opportunity for him to lose that control. Perpetrators are most dangerous when they think they are losing control. You, by definition, represent loss of control because you have some control. You can remove kids. You can go in the home. You can find out bad things about him. So by us being involved, we are potentially putting her at greater risk because he interprets that as loss of control. So that's number one. Any potential safety interventions that we might suggest to her might also be opportunities for him to feel like he's lost control. Try having a protection order served on you, being exited from your home. Might that feel like you're losing some control? Yes. Might that mean for that person a life or death situation where now he realizes for sure the gal who was killed at Thanksgiving in Lincoln, what had she done the day before? She had gone to get help and he knew it. So what did he do the next day? He killed her. Okay? All you got to do is read the paper. They'll never call it domestic violence, but they really should when in the headlines, because then people would see how often it happens. But how many familicides we have to read about in the paper to say, well, she tried to leave, so he went and shot the aunt where she was staying, all the kids in the home, that family in Texas. You see it every day in the news. They just don't call it what it is. That's him having lost control and having responded with great force. So that no harm principle is about what are we doing to make him think he's losing control and how might he react to that. The good news is on your case you actually have an expert and her name is Mom. She knows exactly how he puts the keys down on the cabinet at night. She knows how he shuts the door. She knows exactly what those things mean and she knows what that's going to mean for the rest of her night, okay? So when we're doing safety planning, when we're talking about cases, we need to keep in mind, am I doing something that might be throwing off that power and control dynamic? And is that potential going to cause greater harm or less harm, okay? I hope I made everyone's so sullen now, I'm sorry. We need to sift for red flags, we need to look at information, we need to always be listening for things, just like Jennie says about child development. Pediatricians, 45% of the time, didn't see a delay, and so we may not be seeing delays. Oh, is it really only 3:11? Go us. That clock's not right. I can't read the clock. Anyway, we also, more importantly than not, the next biggest thing I can say with safety planning when we talk about her being the expert is to just ask her what's worked in the past. Have you ever left before? Yes. What did that look like? Well, he did this, and this. I have a woman right now who is the child in the Verizon Keep Your Child Safe app, and he's the parent, so he's tracking her every movement. We have a guy who kept finding her, and we couldn't figure out why we kept moving her. He kept calling the I lost my dog microchip people, saying, I lost my dog, can you track that for me? Well, she took the dog with her, so they would identify her location every time. This has happened a handful of times in Nebraska already this year. So just being aware, again, of what you're looking for, and then please refer her to your local DV program, but not necessarily under duress. You better go to get domestic violence counseling, because we are a voluntary program by virtue of why we exist, and it might be more dangerous for her to come to us, okay? I promise I'm almost done. Reporting. This is something you should all care about, and I call it reporting. I don't necessarily mean it's what you write on a paper. I mean it's how you communicate, report back information in general about your case, okay? So when you're reporting information, let's think about that MBW case. I'm reporting that Mom is lazy, she's not showing up to places, she obviously, actually one of my staff wrote in the notes, oh my God, I had to change it. Mom missed 3 visits in a row, she must not be interested in reunification. How do you know? Turns out she had a detached retina and didn't dare show up, okay? So make sure that we're not subscribing intent to a behavior. So just because someone missed a meeting, just because she is clammed up, maybe he's standing next to the wall staring at her. Or maybe when he dropped her off, he kept taking the keys out of the ignition and said, if you do anything to upend my control during that meeting, this is going to be you. And he pulls the keys out of the car, and then he jumped out. Because she told us what she wanted to do to change her life. His attorney said it in court. She ended up getting a broken neck, lacerated, I don't know, what's right here? Some part that there's only one of them. Spleen, yes. Things like that, because he had threatened to do exactly those things, but I never asked her about it. I never found out what makes her safe or unsafe at meetings, what are barriers for her participating, what are risks for her telling me what's happening in the home. So I was subscribing intent to her behavior. I was not actually just identifying behavior objectively. For all of you in the room, you need to know that everything that comes out of your mouth creates a snowball. Being from Maine, this is a very useful reference for me. We have many snowballs. My parents got 109 inches of snow this year. He told me how many times he wanted to move to Nebraska, and I said, we get 4 inches of snow. It turns into like 6 feet because you got all that wind. But anyway, you create a snowball effect. Everything you say could potentially do harm or good for a victim of domestic violence. If you reframe something intentionally in a way that might be biased or it might suggest some sort of intent to her behavior and it's not objective, you might actually be scratching at that cut. Make sure it's behavior driven. So what are we seeing on the ground? What is happening in the home? It's not she loves him, she called the jail. I will tell you, if you have people making jail calls, it's probably going to save their life. Okay? If she's still saying I love you at the jail, you need to know that one of my clients recently, he had some of his guys move into the house while he was in jail for 30 days. And they had a gun and they had a scope, and what they would do is they would clean the scope. So when the officers did come, oh no, you know, sir, I'm just cleaning my new scope. And the cops actually were like, that's an awesome scope. I love the police department. We work with them so closely, but that's what they told me. I was just checking out their new scope. He would point that scope with the laser at the 3-year-old. Why do you think she's making jail calls? Why do you think she's going to the jail every day to see him during visitation hours? We need to really make sure we're not subscribing intent to a behavior unless we understand the complexity of what we're looking at, because you might get her killed. Benefits of this concept. Everyone in the room, this concept, this idea of behaviors is objective. It's not, there's no more she refused, she was unwilling. It was, she went to the visit, she did not go to the visit. She did this, he did this. It just becomes very objective. There's not a lot of emotion. We don't get confused. Applying the no harm principle, Jennie already touched on that with your documents. If you find out something about what's happening in that home, you might want to ask what you're supposed to do with that information and if what you're going to do with that information puts her at risk. I had a mom who finally confided in me that he punched her in the nose and broke it. Oh, that's a big deal. And so I asked her, what do you want me to do with that information? And so we actually safety planned around how we could have we had a separate meeting with the judge where we were able to tell the judge the information that we had, and we were able to work with his attorney on different ways to have that information but not have it published in the court record so that we could keep her safe. So there are some creative interventions. You need to work with that in the community. And then please stop saying refused, unwilling, or failed. Were any of you late today or like running late? Most of you were here on time. Yeah, I love you. Very good, yes. Is that because you don't respect me? Is that because, what's that? Yes, your dog. So was there a reason you were running late? It had nothing to do with me though, did it? The very first time I trained for the department, a woman was sitting right in the front row in the vortex, and she glared the whole time. I was terrified. I thought she was going to beat me up out in the parking lot later. At the halftime, at the intermission, I overheard her telling her friend, I can't believe I forgot my glasses. I can't see anything up on the PowerPoint. So next time you think about intent versus behavior, think about the girl glaring at you. It might just be because she forgot her glasses. Okay, so now we kind of rock into the very last bit, which is things parents can do. And Jennie's going to kind of highlight them. And keep in the back of your mind, though, some of these perpetrator tactics, how they really are capable of sabotaging the household. And so when we're talking about things parents can do, we need to talk about it in the context of the no harm principle. We need to talk about it in the context of safety. We need to contemplate it in the context of the greater global issue of the violence going on in the home, and whether or not a parent's actually going to be capable of doing that, or much like with the MBW case, are we going to be pulling kids out of the home because she refused, quote, to take them to school, but it was really a protective factor, okay?
I think slides like this are why we ended up doing this together, because I thought I was going to do the lecture series on this, and then I started thinking, I'm not sure all of these great interventions that I'm going to show you a woman can do unless she has a good DV advocate, unless she's safe. Because if you look at this list of things parents can do, and some of it's on your handouts in there, so behaviors that increase bonding, like eye contact, kisses, and hugs, and you think about a perpetrator who wants all of the attention and all of the power and control, and then you have a baby that's getting all of the attention, that's probably not safe for her.
And in fact, I have a case right now. He's my favorite because he writes it in his homework every week for a men's group. His biggest issue with his wife right now is that she loves the baby more than him, which we all know is true.
Yeah.
Or if you have a dog, we love them more. That's okay. But so for him, though, that's really a sign of that power and control. And so as soon as that baby came into the picture, he'd never been physically violent with her. She said, yeah, he would yell at me some. It wasn't always great. It was a little rocky. So that's that under 90% that doesn't come up to the rise to the level of an intake or rise to the level of law enforcement. But as soon as that baby was born, oh my goodness, as she puts it, all hell broke loose, Jamie. So.
And that's why I think when we talk about these things not being mutually exclusive, that they have to be worked on together, because all of the interventions for children who have been exposed to domestic violence have to do with that dyad between the caregiver and the child in healing the trauma. So if we aren't doing it right on this end, if we aren't keeping her safe, and if we aren't healing her trauma, there is absolutely no way that she's going to be able to participate in these things. Like predictable routines, we've already talked about how those get interrupted. Using a soothing voice, reassuring children and point out ways that they are safe. She's not going to be able to do that if she's not safe, you know. Managing their own stress as best they can to stay healthy for the child. If you are, you know, going to be continuing in a relationship and you're unsafe, your primary goal is going to be survival for you and the children. Things that help children who've been exposed to domestic violence are play. And it's focused play where there's no phone, there's no TV on. They're describing what they're doing, so they've got, again, kind of that serve and return. They're building up the language, choosing activities that are mutually enjoyable, and praising those kids. So really having that positive time where they are completely focused on the child. And if you think in terms of what those kids have experienced throughout this, those are the things that they've been missing. So we're going to be trying to make up for this. Again, and I'm probably going to say this on every single slide, we can't do this if she's not safe, because she cannot do these things. Not that she's unwilling to do these things, but that she cannot do these things.
And then you add in the mix, right, the high propensity for mental health and the high propensity for substance abuse, and you're like, yeah, chill with your kid and don't have your phone, but we can't get her sober, and we can't necessarily get her into a place where she's not anxious. Every noise that this woman heard near her window, she would turn, and so she can't participate in some of those nurturing relationships because she's so anxious in the first place. So again, that goes to the heart of managing problems, not just the symptoms, right?
Well, and the other thing is that she wants her cell phone there so she can dial 911.
Absolutely.
But she's got
Right.
to turn it off in order to do these.
That's
Right.
a really good point.
Right.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's not something I necessarily put together before.
Yeah. So again, these are all things after we've done all this great safety planning, after we've gotten mom into the appropriate mental health treatment, after we've got her addressing her trauma. These are things that we hope are happening for the kids to help repair some of the damage that's done. The other thing, and then I'm going to show you clips of, and some of you have seen some of these clips before, but are parent-child relationship treatments. It's absolutely essential that when you've had a child who's been exposed to domestic violence, that you repair that relationship. That secure attachment that was supposed to be happening, where that kid learns everything that they learn about relationships and how the world should be, has to be repaired after this. These are the two evidence-based therapies, child-parent psychotherapy and parent-child interaction therapy. That means I got an email. I don't know how to turn it off, but ding, it's not a bright idea. I am a child parent psychotherapy trainer. That's what I'm going to show you tape of. The reason I like it is because it addresses parent trauma. I have a bullet point up there about ghosts and angels in the nursery. One of the things that we do in child parent psychotherapy is talk to the parent about their own experiences being parented. And some of those things are ghosts. Some of those things are their own childhood trauma that they have not integrated and processed, their inability to parent, because when they see that baby at 3, it triggers memories of their own neglect and abuse that they may have experienced. And then we also talk about those angels and what Jamie was talking about with resiliency. We talk about, the first grade teacher that they had a relationship with, that they remember, the home visitor that came and helped their mom out, and then mom maybe played with him for an hour. They remember those things. It's less structured and it's more geared at dealing with the trauma. Sometimes you will see kids in parent-child interaction therapy. It's more focused on regulation and compliance. There's less of a trauma component. It's going to be more structured. It deals less with the trauma unless there are some kind of offshoots, people that are doing kind of a trauma-focused parent-child interaction therapy. So a lot of you have seen this video before because a lot of you have come to things about child-parent psychotherapy, but we showed you the one case that failed, and actually as we were doing our slides, we were like, this is really depressing because it's very difficult to overcome all of these things. So this case, and some of you will be familiar with it, was in drug court in Lancaster County, and this mom agreed to let us use her tape. And it's been phenomenal because I would be going and I'd be talking about doing therapy with babies, and people were like, really? What are you doing? You lay them on the couch, talk about their mothers with them. They really couldn't understand and had some of the preconceived notions before that, like, these kids don't really know what happened. They don't remember. Kids love their mothers no matter what. It'll be okay if we just leave it alone. This mom had zero social support and just a trauma history that would make all of us, even though we may be hardened from working in child welfare, cry. She's got no support. She's a long-term methamphetamine abuser. She also is in a relationship that is very violent. Her initial reports are that the baby was what when the police showed up? Sleeping. Baby's sleeping, no problem. So I go and I look at the file. There's a SWAT team that descended upon the house. The dad is threatening to kill mom. He's holding the baby. The officers take the baby away and the baby bangs her head against the door jamb. Those are two really different versions of what occurred. And as we did child-parent psychotherapy, what we recognized was it's not her unwillingness to report what happened, but the idea that you would do that to your child, that you would put your child in that kind of situation, was so painful for her that it was much, she couldn't cope with that idea. So it was much more regulating for her to think about the baby sleeping peacefully. The police came in, picked the baby up out of the crib, take the baby. She could deal with that. She couldn't deal with what was really going on. Yeah, it did. It took a lot. And that was a major step in the case, was her to be able to acknowledge the guilt and kind of the blame that she put on herself for staying in that kind of relationship. So she is at a treatment facility where she's getting evidence-based interventions like seeking safety for domestic violence. She's also getting substance abuse treatment. And then she's beginning child-parent psychotherapy. So the baby's 9 to 12 months old. What should 9 to 12-month-old babies be doing? Standing up. Susan, you should just do the whole, the expert list. Pulling to stand. Cruising. Maybe walking if they're verbal. They should be making sounds, babbling. Okay. What about that relationship? What would you expect? I'm going to show you a clip of the assessment where mom is getting ready to leave the room. There's a stranger in the room. The baby's going to be in there. What would you expect the baby to do? She's going to cry, right? So she should be, focused attachment is between the ages of 6 to 9 months where it really starts. So this baby is really picked out their person, for lack of a better word. This is the person who's going to take care of me. This is the person that I'm totally dependent on, and it's mom. So I'm going to show you the tape. And if you've seen it already, I really want you to think about in terms of what we've talked about with serve and return, what we've talked about, that relationship and mom's ability to be there for the baby and see the impact on this. Because it just so happened that this was the tape we chose before, but it is a domestic violence case. What's wrong with that developmentally? What doesn't she do? She first ignores mom when she's leaving. And we talked about gaze aversion and kind of, we would call it parent rejection too. Mom's trying to get her attention and she's not going to engage mom when she's right up close to her face, even when she becomes intrusive. Developmentally, what do you see?
Not very much. Well, in the beginning she was pretty quiet. She babbled a little more toward the end.
Right, she babbles a little bit. Right. And she's actually closer to 12 months. And so, you're hoping that maybe she's mama, da, like starting to form. You don't really hear any of that. This is actually the time she's most vocal, is when mom is out of the room, which is interesting. How many of you have 10-month-old babies or have recently? Do they sit around like this at your house? Like none of my kids ever did. I was always like, oh my God, like you baby-proof your office and your home really quickly when you have a baby this age because they get into everything. She's not exploring. And what we know about that is if she's not exploring, she is not having those experiences where she's learning, she's interacting with her environment, her brain's being stimulated, all of those things. What about her reaction to being in the room alone? Mm-mm. She's in a room with a total stranger with a shiny video camera. And again, I would say those of you who have little kids that are about this age, they would be all over that, trying to engage with that person, trying to get their attention. Clearly, she's been left alone and not interacted with a lot. Given what we know from today, we probably know why, right? She's preoccupied with safety and not attending to the baby because she's got to worry about her own safety and the safety of the baby. She's also depressed, so she's probably unable to interact, and she's using methamphetamines, so the baby is not going to be her priority when she's high. Now, when I show this video, if we didn't set up all this context and you think about this video, what do you think about the baby in general? If you saw this baby and she's healthy, she's a good baby, right? She's not going to get kicked out of childcare. If you're a caseworker, you are not going to get a phone call about her. The foster parent is going to say, she is a great baby. She sits on the floor and plays by herself. In fact, I can leave the room to go get a bottle and she doesn't even cry. That's not developmentally appropriate. It may be highly convenient for you if you have this child, but it's not appropriate. And what that means is that she's missing out on all of this learning early on. So I'm going to show you a tape 6 weeks later after mom has had child-parent psychotherapy. So she's had some sessions with the baby, her and the baby together. You're going to hear the therapist talking in the back, and she's going to be doing one of the most common interventions, which is speaking for babies. So she's giving mom perspective on the baby's experience with things. And I want you to note the difference 6 weeks later.
I did want to just point out really quickly, one of my perpetrators in the last 6 months, one of the things that he would do with the toddling child is he actually would break bottles in the carpet. And so when mom would attempt to intervene, please stop breaking bottles when you're drunk, please don't do this, it's hurting the baby, that actually became a tactic. Because she'd get frustrated, she'd get angry, and at one point when he broke a bottle and the baby was out of the crib, she actually pushed him, tried to push him out the door. She ended up getting arrested for assault. They placed the child with the dad. And that's not anyone's fault, that's right, that's just looking at your context in the moment. You have an aggressive parent who injured another party, had a scratch on his neck. And so, looking at it in that moment, it looked as though, legitimately she assaulted him. But looking at it in the global context, and shockingly in the context of child development and safety, she was trying to protect the child. and he was intentionally breaking the bottle. He told law enforcement that the bottle broke during the altercation, that he would never, and it's in the written report, he would never do that to a baby ever. And so she wasn't believed. No one would ever believe that a dad would drop a bottle in the carpet intentionally, but this is what we're seeing. So.
What's different about that baby?
Way more engaged.
She's way more engaged. Mom's making eye contact with her. She's mimicking things, so she does it, mom does it. What about mom's affect? Because she's farther along in treatment. How does she look different? She's making direct eye contact, she's smiling, she's engaging and describing the behavior for the baby. So all of those things that we were talking about before that parents should be doing, mom's doing. What you'll notice in this video, and I think is most noticeable, is what happens when mom gets out of the frame of the baby's reference. The head is going, she's watching mom. She loses her body posture. If you've ever watched, there's a famous video about a still face where they have the mom interact, then stop, and then interact again. She does almost the exact same thing. So she physically loses control of her body because she wants mom back in front of her. And it's much more appropriate. Now you'll notice when mom sits down, what happens to her mood? She's just immediately regulated because mom is there again, and mom's the safety. She's in front of me. She's paying attention to me. And I always ask this, and it goes to what you're describing about intent. Which baby would you rather go on parenting time with? The second, for sure, right? Your baby cries when you leave it for a second. She's interacting. She's smiling. She's cooing. She's mimicking you. That is parenting time that you want to go on. Parenting time with a baby who does not respond to you, that you can't stop their crying, that they're flat, that they're not smiling when you're smiling at them, is horribly painful for parents because they have a realization that they don't have that bond or that attachment, and they start to wonder things like, I wonder if all that methamphetamine I used had an impact on my baby. I wonder if leaving her in the crib all that time really did do something, and they're going to have to deal with that during that time. What child-parent psychotherapy does is brings all of that out into the room. Mom's able to talk about it. We're able to talk about the fact that we can repair relationships. In 6 weeks, we can repair relationships where the baby's better developmentally. They're on a more normal developmental track in 6 weeks. And that wasn't going to get better without some kind of intervention. Do you have questions about the child-parent psychotherapy specifically, or anything that you saw? So she continues in therapy. We think she's doing wonderful. I keep looking at Marcia because she was involved in the case. She comes into drug court one day and she says, I got married. Who do you think that she got married to? A guy who was on work release for domestic assault. So we are all like, pull our hair out. Like, you know, she's doing so well. She's had all of these evidence-based therapies. You know, she's bonded with baby. We're seeing all this improvement. And what in the world is going on? He did engage in CPP with the baby for a while. He engaged in the process, and she stayed engaged in the process. I think last I heard they were not together anymore. But I do believe it's because she was protecting. He had started using again, and she kicked him out. So I feel like it's a happy ending. But you know, even after all those interventions and all that treatment, again, he sought her out, and she really needed that. She had no social supports, she had no family. So we had done all of this great stuff, but what we hadn't done a great job of is finding her a family other than her and the child to support her. And she found it, and she found it in another man who was much like them before.
They met, she went to...
A sweat, right? Yeah, she was Native American, so they met at a sweat.
He was released, allowed, that was his religion, so he was allowed to go there from prison.
Right.
And that's where they met.
Yeah. So it did have a happy ending, and she was able to make better choices. She had also resolved a lot of her childhood trauma through her own therapy and through the child-parent psychotherapy, though, too, and was able to then make choices to keep her baby safe above and beyond her own needs for maybe that relationship. So therein lies the difference.
This is the last slide, everyone. So if you were like just thinking you're going to get up, just give it like 35 more seconds.
Where you can ask questions.
Oh, yeah. Well, yes, that's right. Then that slide's all about you. This slide's still about us. One thing I want to point out with regards to the parent-child psychotherapy, and one of the reasons that it was effective in that moment is what Jennie is kind of leaning toward, which is this idea that her environment had been radically shifted from prior. She's no longer using. Now imagine that tape if there was a perpetrator in the house and the baby's crying and screaming while she's walking away to the microwave. What's he going to say to her? Stop that effing baby. Yep, shut that baby up. That's actually the exact phrase I've heard recently. And so when we talk about what our role is and we talk about what the capacity is for our system overall to intervene, we really need to be looking at the environment as a whole, as a product of multiple relationships that are evolving within one small space, rather than these kind of snapshots of what we think might be going on. I think the great part about this video is that Jennie also talks about how this mom was unable to kind of talk about what was really happening in the home. Just because you're going to now present in your cases as like super nice and understanding and empathetic, and you're not going to blame her and you're not going to judge her and you're not going to subscribe intent to her behavior, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get this open, honest mom. There are still barriers to that, and those barriers are things related to safety and a pragmatic need for her to make sure that, as Jennie put it, surviving. Okay, and so when our instinct says I need to survive and by default I need to be silent, that's going to take some strategy on your part. That's going to take some real effort. I will tell you, how many of you guys have like a close friend or confidant? Right, most people in the room.
Not this side of the room. They don't have any friends.
No, they don't.
That tells me a lot about all of you.
And so when you go to that close friend or that confidant and you start spilling whatever beans you've got that day, you know, whatever you're really wanting some guidance on, and they kind of fire back at you with some advice, don't you almost always just shake that off and you're like, no, this is really my plan. I know what you're saying, no, but I just can't, no, I have my plan. When we are confiding, when we're rolling out kind of the gory details of our lives to someone, we're not necessarily hoping to solicit advice. But we may be hoping to solicit some information. Today we've given you a bundle of information. One of the strategies your domestic violence programs are going to utilize is feeding this information, almost like a serve and return, back to the survivor who's presenting and say, these are the things that I'm seeing, these are my concerns, and these are some of the things that I know about domestic violence typically. How does this affect you then? And so there's going to be some areas where these people aren't going to be able to really trust you or confide in you. And a lot of that doesn't necessarily have to do with you. It's, how many people have heard child welfare is never about you? It really isn't. So just because your survivor isn't necessarily responding that well to you, it might just mean simply that she's having PTSD symptoms. You represent a perpetrator to her. You represent risk, safety issues. So I just kind of wanted to emphasize that with regards to how do you convince someone to then do services if they don't trust you yet. Trust the fact that they don't trust you and just say, I understand you don't trust me. These are some of my suggestions, because they don't want your advice. So you're not going to be like, I went to this training and she said you should get out. Right? You don't want to hear it, nor do they. They really are going to be that expert. So,
the problem is you've got to have the women, the victims, recognize that they're victims.
Absolutely. I will tell you, they don't know. So when you go, I think you're in domestic violence, they're going to go, what's that?
They go, oh, no. They don't think unless there's actual physical whacking, they don't think it's domestic violence.
And one of the reasons why they don't think it's domestic violence is because they have, when we go back to the tactics, the minimize, deny, and blame, they've been blamed for the violence. So it's not domestic violence, it's something I'm doing. Therefore, it's something I have control over and it's something I should be able to change. So if I just loved him more, if I just made dinner better, if I just kept the kids quiet, this would all go away. But because it's power and control and her level of control is down here, his level of power is up here, she doesn't actually have any impact on that, okay? So most cases that you're going to be dealing with will absolutely have elements of power and control. Full stop. Children cannot truly thrive until or unless that protective parent is able to thrive, and that's when we're talking really about that environment, okay? We want a kid to be resilient. Well, Monica couldn't be resilient in an environment that we never intervened on properly. Needs systematic uptake of things like the Saving Together model, this concept, this domestic violence lens, in order for a systematic change to really happen. It can't just be about one worker, one judge, one probation officer, one guardian ad litem, one CASA. It's really got to be kind of everyone accepting that, because otherwise you're going to go to the table and you're going to go, I'm going to reframe what I'm seeing. That mom got arrested for assaulting him, but did you know that it was because he was about to dip the baby's arm in boiling water? So we have a responsibility to reframe, to provide that global context, but unless there's other people in the room willing to hear that reframe, to kind of get away from those distracting questions, this becomes difficult. So if you don't think you have a role in this, you really do, because there's a lot you can do by simply reframing the context that you see things happening in. Blaming the victim points us to a symptom, not the solution. You're mad at her for picking another guy. We talked about this. If you can get your mind around the idea of a sex predator, please get your mind around the fact that these perpetrators are perpetrating. They are predators. They predate on new victims. They are never absolutely showing you their true colors from the get-go. So she did not pick another bad guy. She picked a guy who she thought was going to be better than the last guy, and he's the one who took advantage of her. Offender accountability is indeed possible when we start doing things like, sir, that behavior is completely unacceptable. You cannot throw glass bottles in the carpet and expect to get away with it in the state of Nebraska. But we don't do that. We say, she got arrested because we read the police report, we got the intake from the police officer, wonderful officer. And so we actually are going to file a petition against her. He's going to be qualified as the non-offending or the protective parent, but we've got it wrong. Can you imagine how this case is going to go now? It's going to go in the wrong direction for a long time until we can sort out the violence. Services aren't effective when the environment remains unchanged. We've talked about this ad nauseum. So you can have, Jennie, who's probably the world's best therapist, involved with these families, but nothing's going to really change long term, just like your diet's not. Like if I go home and eat a bag of potato chips, I'll be like, oh, I didn't lose any weight this week. Well, it's because I didn't change my environment, right? We can be behavior driven, not services driven. Please give people services, but hold them accountable for their behaviors, not just the service. Well, they got that done, but I didn't just say they need to participate in parent-child psychotherapy. I also put in his case plan that he can't sabotage her efforts to go to parent-child psychotherapy. He can't pull the keys out of the ignition every time she's going there. He can't blow up her phone 300 times. Is your name Marcia? Marcia mentioned the idea of, oh, well, having your cell phone when you need to call 911 must be really difficult. It's also really difficult when he calls her 300 times in the span of 30 minutes. So how is she supposed to participate in parent-child psychotherapy when her phone's blown up? And if she doesn't answer her phone, that might be the end of it when she gets home. Okay, and then don't be a perpetrator yourself. This is usually how I end all my trainings, is just don't be a jerk. That's really it. I could have just said that at the beginning and we would be done. But what that really means, and it means it wholeheartedly, is I'm not saying that any one of us is vicious or has a vicious will. I'm not saying that any of us are acting vindictively or attempting to affect child safety negatively, because I told you that my number one assumption is that you're doing good work, and you're doing good work because you care about kids. But recognize that you inevitably are shifting the power and control in the home. And when you think about this concept of no harm principle, by virtue of you existing, you are throwing off that spectrum of power and control and potentially setting in action or setting in motion a course of events that she can no longer protect the children from. And some of that is on us to kind of work on that role with her, okay? Does that make sense? What are you thinking? That's actually not one of the questions you ask a survivor. What were you thinking?
What are you doing with law enforcement? What sorts of efforts are you making to help educate them about all this?
As much as they'll let me.
We need to make a bigger stink, get you in there more.
I think
that really, they're the first responders to the scene of a domestic abuse situation.
I think what you're seeing or what you're identifying is this snowball effect phenomena, right? So whoever got to the scene first is really going to kind of set the stage for what people see for the next X amount of years that the case is open, right?
Because all we have is what they said on the paper until we can...
Right. And that's why, the work that we're doing with the department, the work that we need to do systematically as a community, as a state, is to really help us develop the skills necessary for that rapport building, that trust building, so that you guys can actually get a better feel for what's happening in the household. And like I said, part of the frustration of this training today will be, I'm going to leave you with a lot of unanswered questions. Some people say that means you're going to read the next book or watch the next movie, right? How many people watch Hunger Games and you're like, no, please don't end the movie here. But I will tell you that there are states who are doing this. They're doing this work really well. They're having less recidivism. They've gotten over a lot of the immediate hurdles that you've got in your minds right now. You're like, this will never work here because of this, that, or this person. But I will tell you, we've made it work, and we made it work in other states. So it's possible. No, don't be discouraged.
We have a lot of people.
The fact that I'm standing here with Jennie is
I mean,
like, and people are actually, it was like, Jennie and I thought we would stand here. We didn't know if there'd be anyone actually listening. So the fact that you guys are all here, I mean, that is hope.
But I mean, it sounds like, the police, the caseworkers, the other attorneys, they all, if they're not on board with all of this, it's just going to be so difficult. I mean, I recently had a shaken baby case, and I represented mom. Dad's in jail, and our county attorney said that because she accepted his phone calls.
I bring up the jail call thing because it's a really big thing in Nebraska. I've never actually heard that brought up before in the 3 other states I've trained in, but it's really the intent versus behavior thing. I had a woman who made jail calls in Hastings to our local jail. What people didn't know was that he was not just making calls to his mother like it showed on the phone record. He was having the mom 3-way call to her, but the mom was also the babysitter. So are you going to answer calls from your babysitter when they have your children? Yes. So they actually tried to suggest that she was intentionally having contact, quote, violating her own protection order, which, by the way, you can't do. But really, in the broader context, it was more sophisticated than that and actually quite protective. So where you're saying there's not a whole lot of hope, I can understand where you're coming from. It just depends on what kind of mood I'm in or how much caffeine I've had as to how I feel about that. It doesn't take a lot to actually shift this paradigm. I think the really one, like when I joke at the end and I say just don't be a jerk, I actually really mean that. I think if you had someone judge your behavior and subscribe an intent to it, you ma'am, you're looking at your nails, so I could be like, she is so bored with me. She wants something to do with me, she just wants to get the heck out of here. Is that a Chick-fil-A cup? I have to pick my boyfriend up some Chick-fil-A before we head back to Hastings, so thank you for the reminder. You're not bored with me. Well, you might be, but I mean, you're not going to say it out loud or in public or on camera for YouTube. So I would really just encourage you, if you want to do domestic violence work well, just be a person who's willing to accept the context of someone else's experience. And instead of see, she doesn't care about the training because she has her phone on ring. She's got better things to do. No, I'm just teasing. But so really, it's just about acknowledging that if you were in this situation, how would you perceive it? And accepting that how you would perceive a situation like this isn't necessarily their experience, because they've had a lifetime of trauma, potentially a few years of trauma, and so their lens is going to be altogether different than your lens. And so just trust that that experience is going to be different than yours. Yes, ma'am?
I have a question. Assumptions could lead to judgments.
Yes.
And as professionals, what would be a different way, I don't know, a question that we could have in our mind to take that assumption leading to a judgment? I think that's just who we are.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, we could be very judgmental to the point that it could be toxic because we're in this field so much and all you hear is trauma, 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 and it leads us to assume and judge something that we don't know everything. We need to know the other side of the story. So what's something that when you go into these cases and you see this situation, what's something that comes to mind that takes you away from, okay, is it an assumption or am I judging? How do you view things? What do you think? What's going through your mind when you go through that?
First of all, I accept that I'm judgy. Okay, I'm like super judgy. We all are. And so I think the first thing is like accepting in order to, it's like an AA meeting that I've never been to, they say, in order to change your problem, you have to realize you have one first. So I think we need to accept that we're judgy. I think we need to accept that we have a perspective, we have a bias. In the interviews to become a new staff member at SASA, you have to be willing in your interview to actually tell me in detail about a personal bias you have toward clients. And you have to tell me about a time where you had one. If you can't tell me about a time where you've been judgy, then you can't work at SASA. Because we are all judgy all the time. So there's that. When I sit down and I look at a case with fresh eyes, so I do that a lot. I do that for the department every Thursday at 2 p.m. We have a call and they throw all these cases at me and they say, well, what do we do? The good news is that they already have the answer. They just need to ask the victim. What do you want to do? What would you like to see ideally? There's a whole training about that. I do an entire 8 hours. Sometimes I knock it down to 3 and I have to talk really, really fast. But it's all about that rapport building. So when I'm looking at a case and one of my staff brings it to me or the department brings it to me, the first thing I acknowledge is that there's going to be gaps in the DNA. I already know I don't have all the information, so I'm going to make every diligent effort that I can to ask why or how questions. Mom didn't show for a visit. Well, do you know why? No. Then we need to find out before I'm going to make a decision about any one thing or another. She keeps inviting him into the home. Why? I don't know. Find out. If you aren't able to find out the answers to these questions because inevitably you represent something that could be a threat, I don't want my kids removed. I'm not telling you that I let him in. I'm also not going to tell you that I let him in because he had a gun. Because that makes it a double whammy for me, right? I not only let him in, but I also knew he was armed. And he's a felon, and he's not supposed to have a weapon. And so what I really suggest in those cases is where in supervision with the staff, we talk to them about how are we posing questions? How are we asking them? Are we showing up unannounced? Are we doing things that would otherwise jeopardize her safety? And we actually have to start asking reflective questions about us. So it's not just, well, what's she doing? She doesn't want me in the house. What's not really being told to me. It's also, what am I doing as a worker or as a judge or as an attorney to ask questions that allow people to give me real information, not judgy information. So from your perspective, stop accepting judgy information. That's really simple. If someone says, well, she still loves him, yeah, I know. I have some exes. I still, I love them as people. I hate them as exes, but I love them as people. So get over some of those things. It's really a waste of your time. Talk about exhausting. Well, she still loves him. Yes, ma'am.
So what happened with Monica in the case?
What happened? Dad is serving 25 years in jail for child sexual abuse.
Which dad?
Second dad. Baby Richard's dad, bio dad. Mom could not rationalize what she had done, and she went on quite the binge. The judge TPR'd the kids from dad. Mom surrendered them. All 3 kids, all this week, and I see more messages coming through my phone. I got text message pictures of all 3 kids that were adopted. Baby Richard was adopted by grandma, and then Monica and Robert were adopted by 2 couples who are friends, and so they see each other all the time. And I'm not a type of person who ruminates about cases at night, but I will never forgive myself for that case. We did it wrong forever. And it was us being judgy. It wasn't because I made a mistake, it was because I didn't get past who I was as a person or what I saw on the ground. And I don't just mean I as in me as an individual, but I as in our system. We let her and the kids down, and that's really good because that's motivating to do better work from the beginning of cases. It's really hard to heal cases once you've removed mom's kids 3 times.
What should you have done in hindsight?
What should I have done in hindsight? It's starting to get warm in here. What I should have done in hindsight was listen to her when she told me what was happening. When she told me, Jamie, I can't do this, all I said back to her was, you should. I didn't say, why can't you do this? I didn't say, what's happening in your life? What happened to you before? I'm not a therapist.
So she needed better therapy?
No, and that's what I was going to say. I'm not a therapist. I just needed to have accepted her as she was as a human being, and she would have been much more capable of accepting who she was as a human being. But because my job was so much about, and I say judging, but that's not what we're doing, so much about finding what the maltreatments are, so much about finding about what needs, in order to identify what needs to happen in a home, you have to find out what's wrong. right? So I'm spending all my time finding out what's wrong in the home to make sure that we're intervening successfully. By that process, and by never valuing her as a human through that process, by never saying, I think you are trying really hard, Mom. You know, I can't imagine having a drug addiction and mental health and chronic lifetime exposure to physical trauma from a partner and then from my family. If I'd have accepted her as she was, she wouldn't have spent so much time trying to protect herself from me.
But how could you have let her know that?
I just said it. I should have just said it.
And ask more questions.
Yeah, I should have just said it. My staff always ask me, you know, how do you get these victims to tell you all this stuff? I said, I just ask them. It's really that common sense and that simple. I can't believe people get paid to do this type of training, because when they'll say, well, you're so stressed out about her safety, what'd you do? I said, I told her I'm really stressed out about your safety. What should she do about it? I said, what do you want to do about it, Mom? What's going to keep you safe, Mom? It's really, so it's about two things. It's about you just letting her kind of at least propose her idea or strategy to you, and then you kind of work through that with her. As a department, can we really get behind this? As a judge, as a county attorney, can I actually really get behind this? That mom who drinks the 2 beers at night so he drinks 6 or 8, man, that's a gray area, isn't it? Yeah, we're encouraging booze and written documents as a department. Awesome. But you know, it's really one of those fine lines we have to walk. If we have to realize that people are people in a real life context. You know, you're a person. I'm just letting you know that when I get to Hastings, I'm having a pizza with cheese. I don't know how that'll work in my digestive system. I'm mostly vegan. And then I am having one heck of a Moscow Mule when I get home. If we can't allow our parents to want to go get a pedicure or a manicure, we're too busy judging them about it. She spent her money on a manicure. Or, you know, she drank a drink at a bar. So did you, so did we. So I think so much of this really is just the real basics about humanity and just kind of remembering that. But so I should have asked her better questions. I should have let her know that she was okay as she was, and then she would have been okay with who she was. And if you're okay with who you are, then you can actually confront yourself and actually make changes that are important. But if you can't even confront yourself because I'm too busy ramming your change down your throat, in the nicest way, I'm very nice. It just wasn't happening. So we just got it wrong for too long. You can't fix them all. But that doesn't mean that's like a sad story. I mean, it's a great story. I mean, what a perfect case to tell you guys about. If we didn't have that case, we could never have shown you what real positive change could do for a family. So when David Mandel asked us 7 years ago, pick your worst case, he picked right.
Can you guys provide us with your contact information?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have like a bazillion business cards here.
Do you want to put business cards out? We can just put them out on there, on the front.
But talk to your local domestic violence programs. They are awesomer than me, for sure.
But I think that thing that you say about asking better questions. So when I was in private practice, kids disclosed a lot of things to me, and then it was the same question, like, why did they disclose? Because I asked the question. Mm-hmm. People get really nervous about asking people personal information, and so they don't ask kids, they don't ask parents. And it's this big thing, and what you teach people and kids who've already been traumatized is what's been ingrained in them. This is secret. Mm-hmm. It needs to stay that way. If you tell anybody, somebody's going to get hurt. And so when nobody asks about it, when no one asks her why these things aren't happening, when you don't ask the kids, well, what's really going on, you know, here, that's all reinforced in them. So really asking those questions, but you have to have some kind of rapport. And this sounds very therapist-y of me, but like you have to be an authentic person who is willing to be able to listen to what they're saying and not thinking, I know what she's going to tell me. She's going to tell me that she let him in the house. I knew it. I knew that was going to happen.
And you're going to write it down really fast, and you're going to type it up in your notes. You're going to push that through in your review. I will tell you that just because we have to ask better questions and build rapport doesn't mean it can't happen quickly. I had 5 minutes. This has nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with this amazing teenager. I had 5 minutes with a girl in an interview room with law enforcement. It was being recorded, so she was not keen to talk. And she says, I've been to therapy a lot. And I said, what do you wish you had different? I said, you've had all these therapists. She goes, yeah. And I said, what do you wish would be different about your therapist? What would you change? She goes, I wish they would have asked me what happened to me growing up. I said, so what happened to you growing up? She goes, my brother sexually abused me for years, and my mom won't believe me. Holy really? She said, I've never told anyone before. And I said, well, why did you tell me? She goes, you're the only one who ever asked. She's 18. It had been happening since she was 4. So it really can be as simple as just that directness. that genuine, as Jenny said, directness, really caring to understand. And then when they don't want to tell you, I understand why you wouldn't want to tell me. I accept your silence.
Well, don't you think a lot of it is following their lead? I mean, she kind of gave you these scraps.
Heck yeah. But if I'm too busy with my reporting tool,
You would have missed it.
if I'm too busy with my checkbox, I got to do ages and stages today. I only got 20 minutes. Mom, come on. You might miss those opportunities. Yeah. That's a really good point. And like I said, you guys are already doing really, really good work. I don't think anything that we've talked about here, especially in the last 10 minutes, suggests that you're not doing good work. I don't think any of it suggests that we have to shift every single thing about our system. We don't need a domestic violence docket necessarily. You know, we just need to recognize that we're dealing with humans, and it's really weird when you go check the food in her cupboard. You know, it'd be super weird if someone came in my cupboard, they'd be like, you eat a lot of ramen. I'd be like, I know.
And looking beyond that one snippet in time. I mean, whether or not you have the food in the cupboard that one time, or we talk about this a lot, and I hear this a lot. Well, I saw a visit. I read one report, and the parenting was awesome. That's fantastic, but the 12 months leading up to that, that was not able to happen because there was domestic violence, and not being judgy about it with the parent and saying, you know, you didn't do this, but maybe we know that this is what was happening.
I do that a lot. I do that a lot with people. I say, you know, was there maybe something going on with your safety that prevented you from doing that? And they'll go, oh my God, yes. Okay. So instead of being like, well, you should have called the cops, calling the cops is one of the quickest ways to get a victim either severely injured or potentially killed. Because what do the cops mean for his control? Is he going to jail? Is he going to have to go to trial? Is he going to have a lawyer? Is he not going to be near her to control her?
Well, and she's going to lose her income.
Yeah.
She's not allowed her to work.
Right.
How's she going to take care of the kids? She's going
And he'll be out.
go with the system.
Oh, yeah, he'll bond right out with her last paycheck or something. But there is one last thing, and I'm so glad you guys have kind of given us a dialogue for me to actually remember that. And it's the concept of codependency. From a clinical perspective, can people be codependent? Yes. From a domestic violence standpoint, are victims of domestic violence codependent? No. I see so many no's. They're like, no.
We know that.
I'm glad you know that. I'm going to practice this speech in North Platte and Hastings, and we'll see how it's received. Perpetrators are codependent. Okay, they can't live without perpetrating. That's why they have so many victims. Okay, because they feel so out of control that they need to control their environment. That's why people perpetrate. Okay, and so when you talk about a victim, look how much she survived. Look how tough she is. Look how strong she is. So sometimes when you're leading those conversations with your survivors and you're wondering how you can build rapport with them, from a genuine perspective, you can start out with things like, just by walking through my door or just having this conversation with me tells me how strong you are. And by telling people how strong they are, they're then able to make change in their own lives, and how magical it is when it happens. We haven't had a single case where we haven't had a mom be able to tell us what they want to see ideally and then be able to manifest that when we told them, you can do that. It's a lot easier than hiding in the bushes for Michelle Brito Williams. There are a lot of bugs in Key West, Florida. And snakes.
Oh, good.
Anyway. So we'll leave our information up here.
Yeah, we'll leave it back there.
Thank you guys. Thanks.